Hey guys, I'm Yuruzi. Here's a new series for you. This is What If Minato was the main character. When Naruto's father met his mother, his only impression was that a village out there must have been missing its idiot. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 1, Beginnings. 3 children sat on the iron balustrade above the marketplace, looking down over the swathes of people flowing in through the village gates. One was a girl with tightly braided hair the color of jet with eyes to match, wearing a pale indigo tunic. Her name was AI. Beside her, swinging his legs, was a boy twice her size in girth and height with a face that drew unflattering comparisons with a greedy hamster. He was Saburo. A little way off from either of them sat a boy shorter and skinnier than both his teammates with hair the color of sunlight and eyes the color of the clearest sky at the height of summer. His name was Namikaze Minato, and he was destined to become the 4th Hokage of Konoha and the greatest shinobi in living memory, though at that moment in time he was busy untangling a stick of dango that AI had dropped in his hair. "I don't get why they have to come here," AI complained sullenly, glowering at the influx of weary, dusty travelers being rounded up into groups by Chunin officials. "Why can't they stay in their own village? Jiraiya-sensei says there was a coup d'état in their country," Minato said. He was still picking at the sticky sauce in his hair. "If they go back to their village they'll be killed, so?" AI snapped at him. "How's that our problem? Konoha won't be Konoha if half the people living here are foreigners. They'll overtake us and get free money and food and houses and stuff." Minato thought hard and looked down at the refugees. "But we're at war," he said. "Isn't having more people on our side a good thing?" "They're not going to fight for us," AI said disgustedly. "They're going to leech off our generosity and eat our food and steal our women, and they'll expect us to keep fighting to protect our own and now them too. Our resources are already stretched, we really don't need them coming and taking what we earned for ourselves." It was the kind of thing AI's father said a lot. Minato reckoned she was just reciting what she'd heard at home. He sighed and watched another group of Whirlpool citizens slope through the gates. They didn't look much like trouble, he decided. They didn't even look that much different from the average Konoha citizen, only a lot of them looked tired and sad and some were even crying. There were only a handful of Whirlpool shinobi down there in the crowd, and the rest seemed to be mostly civilian women and children. Minato wondered exactly why those women would steal away the Konoha women. "Where's all the shinobi?" he wondered aloud. A large hand landed on top of his head. "They stayed behind to fight." Minato looked up into the grisly face of his teacher. He bore a sad sort of smile. "They gave their lives to help their families escape. It's nothing but a slaughter where they came from. We're lucky any of them escaped. Can't they start their own village somewhere else?" AI asked petulantly, her arms folded. Jiraiya gave her a slightly bemused look. "Easier said than done. Whirlpool was our greatest ally, AI-chan. If Konoha was destroyed and we had to leave, we too would depend on the kindness of our allies to make it through. We must help them because one day we might need their help." He stroked his chin. "And the women of Whirlpool are notoriously beautiful, it can't hurt to acquire such assets." The 3 students rolled their eyes and looked away. Down below, a group of children were being gathered up separately from the other refugees. Minato frowned. "What's going to happen to them?" he asked his teacher. Jiraiya shrugged. "The orphans. They'll be looked after one way or another." That didn't sound particularly reassuring, but then Minato didn't have to think too hard what it must be like for them to be in a strange place with no family to look out for them. Minato himself didn't have a mother, only a father whom he doubted was even his real father. Suspicion had gradually dawned after 10 years of putting up with beer bottles being thrown at his head with accompanying remarks along the lines of "I should throw you out, because you're nothing but that bitch's bastard child." Minato finally managed to free the dango stick from his hair with a triumphant smile as Jiraiya continued, "They'll probably be enrolled in the academy. Maybe some will be in your classes." AI made a disgusted sound in the back of her throat as if this was some major offense. Saburo didn't seem to care one way or another, but he never talked anyway, so it wasn't unusual for him to be so quiet on this matter. Minato regarded the group of children with a little more interest. They were potential new friends. They were potential competitors and rivals. Maybe there was a child down there who was just as good at ninjutsu. There was no other genin in the entirety of Konoha that could match Minato's skills in any area, but how strong were the genin of the Whirlpool country? Minato didn't know much about that place other than it bordered the sea and encompassed a few small islands, and between those islands swirled the biggest whirlpools in the world. Minato didn't know what a whirlpool was or what it looked like. He just knew that they were big and they were in the sea. But even then he probably knew more about the whirlpools than he did about the people who lived around them. He counted the orphans. There were 15 of them, 11 boys and 4 girls. Most of them were crying, especially the youngest ones, but the last girl, sitting at the edge of the group upon a bag of what were her last remaining belongings, was collected. She sat and stared around with mild curiosity at the buildings and the trees and the uniformed officials moving around taking names. Her hair caught in the light and it shone like fresh blood, a striking characteristic that set her apart easily from anyone else around her. Minato was too far away to make out anything else about her. "Minato! Are you coming?" Jiraiya called to him. His team was moving away down the tiered street towards the bridge. "Ah, sorry." Minato shot the girl with the fiery hair one last look and then quickly caught up with his teammates. Minato was checking out a girl, AI said in a sing-song tone of voice. "I was not," he said furiously, feeling his face heat up. "Yes, you were," she said in the same tone, doing her best to wind him up. Minato and Whirlpool girl sitting in a tree KSSNJ. AI. He protested. "First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes a baby in a baby car." "AI-chan," Jiraiya said reproachfully, making the girl's mouth snap shut in a heartbeat. "And Minato. None of that until you're 18. But 18. Despite people like AI's father assuring everyone that these were the end times for Konoha for allowing such an influx of outsiders into the village, the Whirlpoolers settled in relatively well. Not much really changed about Konoha, other than that new houses had to be built and the constant hammer of construction could be heard all over the village. New faces started appearing at the academy, but their knowledge and skills were so far behind everyone else that they had to have their own special classes. Minato only ever got to mix with them in the training yard during the mid-morning and afternoon breaks. He looked for the red-haired girl every time he went to the academy, but he didn't see her again for almost a month. It was as he was running out of the academy with his test score papers in hand. He had 11 straight S marks, the highest grade attainable, with the intent of rushing to the women's bathhouse to inform Jiraiya-sensei. It never occurred to him for a second to go home and show his father either now or later that he came across her once again. His route took him past the bakery where the hot bean bread was baked that made his stomach rumble every time he passed by, though he never had the money to waste on fanciful things like treats and snacks. That day there was a gang of children gathered in the path between the bakery and someone's fenced-off wild garden. Minato paused and slowed down, wondering what all the shouting was about. "Give it back! Why? You can't wear this in Konoha. If you want to live in Konoha you have to wear our symbol. Give it back, or what? I'll scream. Ooh, I'm trembling in my..." A piercing shriek split the air and everyone in the near vicinity flinched and recoiled a little. Minato peered over the shoulders of the other kids. His eyes widened to see the same red-haired girl as before standing at the center of the gang, anger twisting her face as she faced down one of the largest bullies the village had to offer. He appeared to be holding her Hitayate. "Is that all you do?" He jeered her. "Some kunoichi. Give it back, or I'll bite you." She snarled at him. The bully laughed and drew back his hand. "If you want it," he said, "you're going to have to get it." And he threw it on top of the bakery roof. As everyone laughed, the girl's face fell in dismay, although something close to utter detestation was beginning to harden there. Minato looked up at where the Hitayate lay on the edge of the roof, its long, dirty white ribbon dangling down to flutter in the draft one of the humming bakery vents. While the rest of the kids laughed and carried on teasing the girl, Minato folded up his exam results and carefully placed them in his mouth. He walked up to old drainpipe running down from the roof and summoned a little chakra to his hands to help aid him as he began to climb. Gradually the laughter faded as he quickly shimmied up the pipe and reached across to catch the fluttering ribbon. By the time he had it firmly in his hands the alley below was deathly silent, but he paid them no mind as he dropped back down to the ground and turned to face the girl with the red hair. She didn't look quite the same as she did a month ago. She seemed to have hacked off most of her hair with a blunt kunai and now it was an uneven, jagged mess that framed her grubby face, though the color was no less striking. She also wore clothes that seemed to have been meant for boys and if he hadn't seen her before in a dress, it would have been easy to mistake her for a boy. But her eyes defied that. They stood out above every attempt she'd made to diminish her looks, like swirling pools of green and blue beneath long dark lashes. They narrowed distrustfully at him as he approached. He gave her a smile to show he meant no harm, and held up the hitayate for her to take. She made no move to take it, so instead he stepped forward and pressed the protector over her forehead. He made quick work of tying the knots at her nape and then stepped back to see her reaction. A dark pink stain colored her cheeks now, and as she looked up at him, the light caught on the metal plate of her hitayate and the symbol of Whirlpool flashed in his eyes. She was grateful, he was sure. She just didn't know how to express it. At least that was what he thought until she punched him. Very hard. In the gut. As Minato fell with a winded wheeze to the ground, the girl looked fiercely at the bully who had accosted her originally and jabbed a thumb at her hitayate. I am Uzumaki Kushina of Whirlpool. One day I'll be the greatest kunoichi in the world and don't you forget it. And then she turned and shoved her way out of the ring of spectators to flee out of sight between two houses. Finally able to breathe, Minato rolled onto his back and stared skyward. Uzumaki Kushina, he murmured wonderingly between coughs. What a horrible girl. Faces peered down at him and he could tell that they all thought he'd spoiled their fun, but Minato had the unusual gift of popularity and people found it difficult to dislike him even when he was doing stupid things like this. Even the worst bullies didn't have the heart, or perhaps the nerve, to pick on him. Except for AI. She was always picking on him. You're such a bleeding heart, Namikaze, someone said as they helped him up. I should punch you too for being such a div, the bully grumbled. It wouldn't be half as hard as the one I just got, he rasped. The gang dispersed and Minato sat up slowly, carefully cradling his abused stomach. That girl, Kushina, hit as hard as Saburo did, and that was nothing to be taken lightly. If he ever saw her again it would be far too soon. Driven to such distraction, he almost forgot about his test results. They'd fallen out of his hand when the girl had punched him, and he sat massaging his belly for a long time before he remembered them and carried on his search for Jiraiya-sensei. He found him at the training grounds, sitting against the wall as he tapped a pencil against a small notebook in his lap. What did you expect? He said, when Minato showed him his results. You're a genius. This was true, so Minato started telling him about the red-haired girl and her killer right hook. Is it possible? The most soft-hearted boy in Konoha has finally met someone he can't stand? Jiraiya-sensei. Minato murmured, embarrassed. Wind blew through the training grounds, ruffling up his blonde locks. I just don't get it. I was trying to be nice and then she just punched me. I don't know what her problem is. Women, Jiraiya grunted in a derisive tone, as if it was all Minato needed to know. It is the purpose of their gender to confuse and abuse us men. Never forget how heartless they are, Minato. When a woman says no, she means, do the dishes first, and when she says yes, she means, until I change my mind, and if you don't figure out their secret code they'll get upset and blame you for everything. Don't try to understand what motivates their strange brand of female logic. Better men than us have tried and gone mad in the process. Minato watched his sensei scribbling furiously away in his notebook, muttering something like, that's good, I'll use that somewhere. I thought you liked women, Minato pointed out. That is the curse we bear as men, Jiraiya said sadly. Women make our lives difficult with their contrary ways, but masochism is in our blood. We can't live with them. We absolutely cannot live without them. Of course, you're young, and you don't yet realize what it is about the fairer sex that endears them to us. Minato wrinkled his nose. Endear? He repeated. Girls are useless. They're always either giggling in groups and talking about you behind your back or punching you in the stomach and rubbing food in your hair. How can anything about them be endearing? Jiraiya chuckled. When you're older you'll understand. What are you writing? Oh, never you mind. His teacher quickly snapped his book shut and shoved it inside his vest. Show me that nature manipulation you're working on. Always eager to show off, Minato clambered to his feet and clapped his eyes on the 3 tall posts protruding from the ground a few yards away, reaching toward the sky. He took a moment to find his stance and focus his chakra, and then with a sharp strike of his arm, a gust of air so sharp it sang as it cut through the air went streaking towards the posts. In the quiet that followed, 3 loud bangs could be heard as each post was severed and the top halves came crashing down to earth. Minato looked on happily. Jiraiya sucked his pencil thoughtfully. You figured out some form manipulation too, huh? Yeah, Minato said. But it could be better, couldn't it, sensei? You said there were different grades of manipulation for both nature and form. What would happen if you used the highest grade of form manipulation with the highest grade of nature manipulation? Something catastrophic, no doubt, Jiraiya said darkly, but he seemed amused. It could work in theory, but first you'd have to figure out what exactly the highest form is. I doubt even you could figure it out and be able to control it, as well as imbue it with nature. Minato pouted. I bet I could. Egotism doesn't suit you, Minato, Jiraiya said as he got to his feet. Although it's probably deserved. Sensei, it's a nice day, Minato. Don't you have anything fun planned? Worry less about your training and go have fun. Chase some girls. Figure out how to avoid being punched. But I think I need to do some more research for my book. After that, Minato realized he might have seen Uzumaki Kushina around more often than he'd realized. He'd previously been on the lookout for that pretty girl in the dress with the long red hair, whereas in reality he should have been looking for a dirty-faced tomboy with a fringe as crooked as the horizon above the Iwa Mountains. Now that he knew what to look for, he started seeing her almost everywhere, although he was beginning to wish he wasn't. Being that she was in the special catch-up classes with the rest of the Whirlpool children, the only time they ever really crossed paths was in the playground. She was friendless and sulky, and mostly sat alone on a swing at the end of the grounds where few kids played. No one approached her, save for the academy instructors who often tried to cajole her into playing with someone other than the swing. She only ever stared stolidly back until they left her alone. Her Whirlpool headband seemed more worn and dirty every time Minato saw it, but she never took it off. Some of the kids even joked that she probably slept in it. Later, Minato would learn that this was actually true. In the spirit of the Good Samaritan, he tried to approach her 2 more times in order to befriend her. Once by offering to push her on the swings, she pushed him in the chest without a word and stormed away, and once by sitting next to her at lunch and asking if she liked the baked beans, she didn't, so she dropped her portion over his head. After that, Minato vowed not to bother with her again. She was friendless for a reason, and his hair had taken enough abuse from girls to last him a lifetime. For the most part he lost interest and forgot about her. His days were filled with training and learning and practice and field assignments. That ambitious claim he'd made to his sensei about mastering the ultimate form manipulation was something he was struggling to live up to, and any spare time he had was dedicated to crawling through the library and finding every book ever written on the subject of form manipulation in order to better understand it. When the last year of his time in the academy approached, he had just turned 10 and was desperate to get a move on. Come the following year he would graduate and his team would finally be certifiable ninja ready for deployment. For all his life wars had been raging unheard in the distance. Jiraiya sensei had fought in them and returned many times as a decorated hero for the lives he'd saved. Minato wanted to be a hero, one who all the nations talked about. Allies would whisper his name with awe and admiration, and enemies would whisper it with fear. But first he had to finish his homework, and it was in this last year that he was forcibly reminded of the Whirlpool refugees. They'd been filtering through back into the regular classes as they gradually caught up, though they had to be forgiven for their slowness. When you were from a country right at the heart of 2 wars, schooling was probably the last thing on your mind back there, and Minato's hope that he would find a suitable challenge amongst them was looking like it would go unfulfilled. Then that girl arrived in the class. As one of the last to be transferred, she was one of the slowest. She sat at the back of the class with a permanent scowl on her face, and when Minato ever chanced to look at her work, all he noticed was a lot of large, uneven handwriting that meandered across the page like the lines on the paper were just for decoration rather than guidance. Whenever the teacher asked her a question, half the time she wouldn't say anything, and the other half she would just give the wrong answer. The class was often split into pairs or groups for assignments, and it happened often enough that it was only inevitable that he eventually found himself forced to sit next to her and try to communicate with her. It was rather like talking to a wall. So if 2x plus 4 equals 12, x must be 4, you see? Minato said, showing her the equation. Kushina didn't give even the merest flicker of acknowledgement. Her head was rested on her folded arms over the desk and she was looking away from him quite pointedly. You see, because, if you take away 4, the equation becomes 2x equals 8. So you just have to divide 8 by 2 and you get the value of x. Which is 4. Right? Minato tried to push the textbook towards her, but she only leaned away. Come on, it's easy. You get this, don't you? No, I don't, she said baldly, but this is important. No, it's not. She snapped, lifting her head. When you're out there with people setting fire to your house and men pulling your mother into the street, you're not sitting there thinking what X might equal. She put her head back in her arms and went back to ignoring him. Minato didn't bother her again. He quietly filled in the rest of the answers himself and thought to himself that perhaps her vehemence against academic subjects might have been more understandable if she hadn't been equally bad at the practical and physical aspects of schooling. She wasn't the fastest on the track. Her elementary ninjutsu techniques were weak, and despite being left-handed, she would only hold a kunai in her right hand. That's how we are taught in Whirlpool, was her contrary response whenever she was criticized. Minato was inclined to think Whirlpool had it wrong, but at least it explained why her handwriting was so atrocious. The year passed swiftly, and before he knew it, summer was upon them and the final exam results were being handed out. As predicted, Minato passed with the best marks in the year, and the best marks of the last 50 years, for that matter. AI and Subaru naturally passed with better than average grades, and didn't seem to mind Minato too much as long as he didn't rub his results in their faces. The only one in their class who didn't pass was the red-haired Kushina. There's obviously something wrong with her, AI said icily. In the head. They were standing out in the playground, fresh from the high of receiving their results, surrounded by other ecstatic children and their proud parents and teachers. AI's father was standing a little distance away talking with Subaru's parents and Jiraiya. Minato's father hadn't appeared, which Minato himself was rather glad of. The last time his father had managed to pull himself out of a bottle and attend some important parent-teacher event, it had been rather embarrassing. Minato was perfectly happy to share this moment with just his team and his teacher, though when he looked across the grounds at the girl sitting alone in the shadows upon the old swing, some of the happiness went out of him. She hadn't passed, but even if she had, there was no one to cheer with her. No one cared, not in the least, because Kushina had spent her years in the academy doing her best to make sure of it. It was easy to stand with AI and take the attitude that this foreign girl had no feelings to hurt and she deserved all her misfortune with such a bad personality, but when he saw Kushina sitting there by herself, staring at the headband in her hands whose ribbon had finally deteriorated and was no longer wearable, how could he feel anything but sadness? It wasn't her fault she had been born without talent or brains, any more than Minato deserved praise for being born a genius. So he said, "Leave her alone, AI. How would you like it if someone said that about you?" His teammate looked affronted. "Well, why don't you just go marry her if you love her so much?" Subaru laughed, one of the few sounds he ever made, and Minato retreated to the relative safety of Jiraiya's shadow. It might have been a mistake, because the moment he did, his teacher seized his shoulder and dragged him out into the open again. "Ah! Here he is, sensei, the one I was telling you about. Minato, say hello to the Hokage." "Hello, sir," Minato said, looking up at the tall and, to his young eyes, extremely old man standing before Jiraiya. Other adults he'd never seen or met before but whom were wearing equally official-looking robes and uniforms peered down at him curiously. "Congratulations on your results, my boy," said the Hokage with a grandfatherly kind of smile. "The best for 50 years, I hear. It seems you have broken my record." Minato's eyes widened. "I'm sorry, sir." The adults laughed and the Hokage grinned broadly. "I supposed we can expect many great things from you, Namikaze," he mused, though the laughter in his eyes faded as they wandered over to the lonely girl on the swing. "Shame it wasn't 100% pass rate this year. I was so hoping that all the refugees would have caught up by now, but the immigration committee will be on my back again, no doubt. We'll just have the girl tutored over the summer," said one of the Hokage's advisors quietly. "She can retake the examinations before next year and it'll count. Perhaps one of her friends." "Kushina doesn't have friends," Minato told the woman. "A little socially awkward, that one," Jiraiya intercepted hurriedly. "Although Minato's the only person she's opened up to. He's a kind boy, very patient. A natural teacher, one might think." Minato stared up at Jiraiya blankly. What on earth was he trying to suggest? Kushina had only opened up to him in the same way a Venus flytrap opened up to an insect. Yes, there's something very fitting about that, the top student lifting up the dead last, yes. The Hokage stroked his chin for a few moments, gazing skyward. Then he smiled again. "Then it's settled," and he wandered away with his entourage to meet more parents and teachers, leaving Minato absolutely lost as to what had been settled. He turned to ask Jiraiya, who was looking unusually crafty. It was the expression he normally wore when he said he was thinking about research trips. Suddenly he felt very worried. "This is your chance, Minato," Jiraiya said, bending down to conspire with him. "For what, sensei?" Minato asked apprehensively. If he was about to be asked to sneak into the bathhouse to steal underwear again, he was out of there. He still had the bucket-shaped dents in his back from the last time, and he found he was getting rather too old to be able to widen his eyes and wobble his chin to ingratiate himself to a pack of naked women. To tutor Kushina. Minato looked across the grounds at the girl on the swing who was now exploring the inside of her nose with a finger. He looked quickly back at his sensei. "I don't think so." "No, think about it, Minato," Jiraiya said, holding up a hand as if to slow him down. "You have broken the 50-year record, the record set by the current Hokage himself. Do you know what old Sarutobi-sensei was thinking when he met you just now?" "Ah!" Minato scrambled for the answer. "He was thinking if you might very well be fit enough to become the next Hokage." Jiraiya spread his hands with a grin, but Minato only stared. "Oh, come on, kid, don't tell me you've never thought of it. Every child dreams of becoming the Hokage, and you're the brightest boy in the school. If anyone has a chance, it's you." "Ah!" Minato said again. "But there are more qualities required to be considered than simple brilliance. You must be kind, patient, benevolent, and wise. If you can bring that little viper over there up to scratch before the end of the summer, I think it will prove something to the Hokage and the rest of this village. It would certainly prove that he could work miracles." "This seems awfully calculated," he said mistrustfully. "Then look at her." Jiraiya turned him to point in Kushina's direction again, now wiping something suspicious off on her shorts. "If she doesn't pass this summer, she'll have to repeat the year. She'll be older than the other kids and even more of an outsider than she is now. Don't you think, after her hard life, she deserves to have someone take the time to help her? I've spoken to your teacher, Minato, and it's true. He says you are the only one she's opened up to, but she's hardly said more than 3 words to me. Then that's more than she said to anyone else. Maybe you haven't noticed because everyone wants to be your friend, Minato, but however small the signs, you are the only one she likes. If there's anyone who can help her pass, it's you." Minato felt his shoulders sag. He could see his summer slipping away. He should have been imagining the coming summer months with his team, going out on fun, dumb D-class assignments and training like hell in the fields reserved for graduated ninja. Instead he could see his days filling up endlessly with that horrible girl's face. "I suppose, someone has to," he said at last, his heart feeling heavy. Jiraiya beamed. "And this is why you'll make a great Hokage," he said, and when Minato looked puzzled he ruffled the boy's hair. "Only you would throw away a summer on a hopeless case like her." Oh. This was not a great boost of confidence. The fact that Minato felt awful made him rather worried that he really wasn't so kind and patient after all. And as he crossed the grounds towards the swing he began to wonder if he was doing this to, as Jiraiya had said, prove to the Hokage and everyone else that he was a nice person, or if the only one he needed to impress was himself. Kushina watched him as he approached the same way a wild animal did, one who was deciding whether or not to bite or flee. "Come to rub it in," she snarled, "Mr. Smartypants." He felt even worse. "You have another chance, you know," he mumbled, feeling rather hot behind the ears. "You can retake the exams in 2 months. She sniffed loudly and wiped her nose. It was bleeding a little. "What, and fail again so you and all your stupid fans can come and laugh at me a second time?" she said sulkily. "Why don't you go back to crawling up that old man's arse? He's the leader of your village, isn't he? What, do you fancy yourself the next boss or something?" "No, look, it's your village too," Minato protested. Kushina stuck out her tongue, along with her middle finger. For a moment he was too shocked to speak. That was something he'd never seen a girl do. "My village is Whirlpool," she said, practically baring her teeth at him. "It's the most beautiful village in the land with the strongest ninja. And I'm going back there soon, so what do I need to pass your stupid exams for?" Minato bit the inside of his cheek. Last he'd heard from AI, what was left of Whirlpool wasn't so pretty anymore. "But is that why you don't try? Because you don't care?" he asked quietly. Kushina pulled another face. "No, I'm just stupid," she retorted, "that's what they all say." "That's what you all think." "I don't think that," he said, not knowing if it was a lie or not. Kushina had never struck him as unintelligent, just extremely unmotivated, but that could have been a consequence of not understanding her lessons, he supposed. Hey, you could prove to everyone that you're not stupid, if you work really hard this summer. She rolled her eyes. I'll help you. Kushina threw herself out of the swing so fast, Minato took a hasty step back. Leave me alone. She exploded. Who do you think you are, lording it over me all the time? I hate you. I'm not lording anything over anyone. He cried defensively. I just want to help you. No, you don't. You're just another arrogant Konoha boy who looks down your nose at me. I can't help it, you're so short. Go away. So you want to repeat the year? He asked incredulously. No, she snorted. But I'm not going to. I told you, I'm going back to Whirlpool when the Civil War ends. You think that'll be before the end of summer? She remained quiet, scuffing her badly worn sandals into the dry grass. It might not calm down in your country for years. At least if you pass, you won't have to go back to the academy ever again. She was tempted. He could see an ugly frown forming on her brow every time he mentioned the academy. She must really have hated the place. So how does that work, then? She asked petulantly. You helping me? I can tutor you. Where? Your house. Minato had never invited a friend over to his house before, and he didn't much like the thought of even the unpleasant Kushina meeting his father either. How about yours? He regretted it immediately because her stare turned colder. I don't have one. Now he felt awful. Okay, how about me meet at the library next week? Monday morning? She stared at him balefully, so he took that as a yes and was walking backwards away from her so fast he was halfway across the grounds before he turned around. He found himself practically nose to nose with AI. What was that about? She demanded, arms folded. He wondered if this was what it was like to have a mother. Nothing, he said, which he should have known would only make her more suspicious. Were you organizing a date or something? Her dark eyes narrowed on him. No. Jiraiya strolled up behind her. Well? He asked. Next Monday. I thrust a finger at him. Aha! It is a date. No! Minato cried again, growing frustrated. It wasn't that he didn't want anyone to think he was dating Kushina, he'd much rather no one thought he was dating anybody. At 11, going with a girl was more a subject of ridicule than envy, because although they were now graduated ninja ready to take on their first assignments, they still hadn't grown out of the view that the opposite sex was a natural enemy. In Kushina's case, very much so. But AI was already off, skipping through the crowds of genin, parents, and teachers, singing in a loud, piercing voice. Minato and Kushina sitting in a tree Ksenji. Her voice faded into the distance, but more than a few people were looking at him now and were witness to the alarming shade of red spreading across his cheeks. But some of the adults didn't seem so interested in what AI was shouting, and when they looked at him he distinctly heard a few mutters. Top of the year. Scored higher than the Hokage. Such a handsome boy. Looks just like his mother. Minato sighed and, rather fed up with the whole day, decided to go home and let his father know he was now a fully fledged ninja with possibly the most brilliant mind in the village. He might as well get it over with, and his day couldn't get much worse anyway. When he arrived in the small, dirty little apartment at the edge of the village, his father was where he was most days, sitting in his armchair, a framed photograph of Minato's mother in one hand and a bottle in the other. From the doorway, Minato leaned into the room. I passed, Dad. That's nice, boy, his father said, his voice thick and slurry from drink. He didn't look up from the picture. I'm proud. Minato figured he ought to go to his room now, but his father's admission of pride surprised him and he felt the need to validate it. I came top of the class, he added. Did you? Something twinged there in his father's expression as he looked up, as if it was suddenly dawning on him that his son was standing there and he had been trying for the last 7 years of his life to become a genin. Yeah, highest scores for 50 years, he said quietly with a faint blush, and when his father only stared he hastened to add, higher than Sarutobi-sama. His father looked away with a faint scoff. You're a little liar, Minato. Minato's heart began to sink. I'm not lying, it's true. How could a bastard like you hope to consider yourself equal to the likes of the Hokage? His father sneered at him. He'd never attended any of Minato's parent and teacher meetings, so he had to be forgiven for having no idea. If you just asked Jiraiya-sensei and humiliate myself before one of the jonin? You'd love that, wouldn't you, boy? You're nothing more than a dirty little liar, he spat. Just like your mother. He hurled the object in his hand at the doorway and Minato promptly stepped back and watched it shatter against the wall on the other side of the hall. Almost at once his father gave a great groan of alarm and lurched to his feet to stagger towards Minato. I'm sorry, he cried. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I lost my temper. I didn't mean it, I'm sorry. And he carried on staggering right past Minato to sink to his knees beside the shattered picture frame. The photo inside was scratched terribly, almost obliterating the smiling face beneath the fragmented glass. Forgive me, his father babbled on, dropping the wretched bottle he'd intended to throw. I didn't mean it. Minato went upstairs and, for the rest of the evening, played picnic with his parade of stuffed animals. Chapter 2, Sides Unseen. That first week after graduation it seemed as if summer had come into full bloom. Kids of all ages released from the academy were free to roam the streets and the sound of childish laughter could be heard everywhere as the sun shone down on the village and flashes against windows. Everyone seemed happy. After all, who could be gloomy on such a beautiful day? Minato. That was who. Having spent the past year longing for this summer when he could finally begin official training with the other graduates and the more seasoned Nin, he was feeling pretty hard done by. This was because on a day when he should have been running around like a lunatic in one of the genin training grounds with AI and Subaru, enjoying the sunshine and the smell of fresh green life, he was on his way to shut himself into the village library with a girl who went everywhere with a little storm cloud over her head. He was half hoping she wouldn't even bother to show up, or had forgotten their appointment. But that was hopeless. If she failed to turn up, other kids in his position might just shrug and go play outside. Minato knew he was pathetically responsible enough to track down where she lived and remind her all over again about the consequences of failing her exams twice. It was needless speculation. When he arrived at the library, she was already there waiting for him on the steps, wearing what he suspected she'd been wearing a week ago on graduation day. Had she at any point taken those clothes off and washed in the intervening time? Ready? He asked her, smiling a little fixedly. She looked at that smile in disgust and went inside ahead of him. Although he initially dreaded these lessons, as the days slid past he grew to consider the tutoring rather less hostile than he'd initially expected. There was even something extremely cathartic about reciting information from books he knew off by heart to a catatonic nitwit who spent most of the time with her forehead pressed to the library table. So you see why lightning is greater than earth, but weaker than wind. NNNNN. Minato saw himself as a rather diligent teacher, it was just his pupil who was unwilling. She pulled faces, picked her nose, and was a genius at making him feel like the stupid one for having bothered to learn all the stuff in the first place. You need to get this or you won't pass. He warned her. Yees. But it was a case of leading a cat to a pond but being unable to make it swim, and if he tried to force the issue, he would find claws permanently lodged in his arms for his trouble. She was not only disinclined to learn, but vehemently opposed to it for some personal philosophical reasons. When will you ever need to know the boiling point of water when you're fighting someone? It might come up, he said quietly, though he knew that wasn't the point. A shinobi wasn't also a warrior of great skill, but a man, or woman, of great intellect and wisdom. Having a rounded education developed them as people, rather than as just killing machines. He'd already explained that to Kushina but she'd just looked at him like he was an idiot again. Occasionally the lessons would move outside when the subject turned to improving physical skills, and although he was cleared to use the proper training grounds, as an academy student Kushina was still restricted to using only the academy grounds which were, typically, closed off during the summer holidays. The only places they had in which to practice were the narrow, broken alleys behind houses, and a few abandoned buildings in the oldest districts. They had to be careful. If the Uchiha police caught them messing around condemned houses and shops, they'd be sent home with a flea in their ear. For the most part, however, Kushina was just about as enthusiastic in practical matters as she was intellectual. He showed her all the basic jutsu she needed to know to pass the test, and when she wasn't mispronouncing their names, she was mixing up the hand seals. You're left-handed, he tried to tell her. You have to take that into account when making the seals. Everything is reversed for you. That's not how we were taught in Whirlpool, she said sullenly, continuing to hack her kunai away into the ground with her right hand. Minato didn't know what she was doing. She was supposed to be making a clone, not digging holes in alleys. Whirlpool might have had it wrong, he said tiredly. Kushina just glared at him. You only have 2 months left, he sighed. If you haven't grasped it all by then what? Then you'll have to repeat the year. I can only help you so much. Fat lot of help you've been then, she grumbled, and soon after they parted ways. The sun set on another long and unproductive day, and Minato spent the evening, as he did most evenings, mentally going over the lesson plan for tomorrow, wondering how he was supposed to get the importance through to her. Then he counted the food supplies in the fridge and calculated he would have to go shopping next Saturday if he and his father were going to have enough to last through the following week. He used the last of the chicken to make a supper of sweet chicken strips and rice balls, and separated it onto 2 plates. On his way to eat upstairs in his room, he stopped beside the sofa in the living room where his father was stretched sideways, snoring heavily. He'd been asleep since Minato had arrived home, so he certainly hadn't eaten yet. "Dad," he called softly, placing the plate on the sofa cushion beside his father's head. "It's your dinner, Dad." Gingerly, he shook the man's shoulder and tensed up as he stirred and blinked open his bloodshot eyes. Sometimes his father really didn't like being woken up, and one had to be prepared to duck. Those puffy red eyes fixed on the plate nearby, and with a groggy croak, his father reached out to pat Minato's unkempt blonde locks. "Why, a good boy, son," he said, though it was hard to make out. Once upstairs, changed into his pajamas and munched his rice balls contemplatively. "Kushina. Kushina, Kushina, Kushina." It was the only name that went through his head these days, and each passage was tinged with exasperation, worry, and a growing sense of nihilism. He had met the immovable object, whose existence had until recently been hypothesized only by philosophers, and he had been tasked to move her up a hill. It wasn't happening. The end of summer was approaching, the last chance to pass the exams was going to come, and at this rate Kushina was going to perform as badly as last time. He'd disappoint Jiraiya-sensei. He'd disappoint the Hokage. He'd disappoint all those strangers who'd gathered around, holding him to the expectations of his mother. He might have worried about disappointing his father, but as of yet the man knew nothing of his attempt to tutor the academy's dead last student. Most of all, he would have disappointed himself, because he would have failed Kushina. He owed her nothing, he thought. She was always mean and rude and standoffish, as if she resented these lessons even though no one was really forcing her to take them. But she only needed the right guidance, the right approach, the right person. He couldn't fail her. So when he went to meet her the next day at the same alleyway behind the bakery, one of the few places they had yet to be chased out of by the Uchiha police, he was a little surprised to see her performing a perfect nature manipulation jutsu. He stopped dead when he saw her, sitting with her back against the wall of the bakery, beneath one of its huge humming vents that poured the sweet, yeasty scent of fresh bread that was opposite a sagging, broken chain-link fence that backed onto someone's badly neglected garden. But little by little, the fence was breaking even more. One link snapped, then another. A third went flying off with a ping, and the fence shuddered. Kushina just sat, flicking her finger with every snap of metal. "What are you doing?" he asked. She froze, fingers suddenly clamped between her knees in a bid for innocence. The fence wobbled to a peaceful standstill, as if breathing a sigh that the abuse had stopped. "Nothing," Kushina said, eyes wide at him. "I wasn't doing nothing." That meant she was doing something, but he hadn't really managed to make her understand about double negatives yet, so he refrained from pointing it out. "Were you using jutsu?" "No," she said quickly. "Nature manipulation is just one of the fundamentals." Fundamentals? He'd only been instructed about nature manipulation a couple of years ago by his sensei, and he knew for a fact that it was advanced Chunin-level stuff that had never been taught at the academy. Minato went over to the fence and ran his finger over the cuts in the links. They were perfectly, incision-like strikes with a precision that must have taken years to master. He looked back at Kushina, who was still staring wide-eyed at him as if she was expecting him to shout at her. He'd caught her vandalizing a fence, but really, that was nothing compared to this revelation. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded. "This is C-class or even B-class stuff." She stared at him, nonplussed. "This is basic," she said. "No, it isn't," he cried. "I've been breaking my back to show you how to do a simple shadow clone, and you can already manipulate nature." "What are you, earth? No, wind." "Are you wind?" "I'm wind," she said. A curious expression came over her that Minato didn't think he saw too often. She was surprised. "I'm wind too," he cried happily. "This is perfect. I know loads of wind jutsu I can show you, but why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you show that to the examiners?" A sullen scowl wrinkled her nose. What would have been the point? She stuffed her hands deeply into her pockets. I showed the instructors what I could do when I arrived, and they told me it didn't matter. I had to relearn things the proper way or I wouldn't become a Konoha genin. They didn't care that I was already a Whirlpool genin. You what? Minato stared at her in amazement. You're already a ninja. Angry, bitter tears were starting to leak down her cheeks, dripping off her nose and dotting the metal plate bearing the Whirlpool insignia that was now hung around her neck these days from a freight string. She hesitated, as if she thought she'd already said too much. Then she cried wretchedly, since I was 9. So, you've already taken the test? He asked doubtfully, because it seemed amazing to him that someone who had passed the genin exam 2 years ago would have such trouble with it now. It wasn't the same, she said, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. Here you teach about deception and hiding, you're all taught the same tricks to use against each other, and how is that any help? In Whirlpool we're taught according to our strengths. Each of us is unique, so you're taught about nature manipulation first? He guessed. Minato was impressed with the tough regimen, but he didn't think it could possibly be an effective way of teaching, not if it produced people like Kushina whose jutsu fundamentals were as weak as her academic knowledge. What good was it to master nature manipulation when you could barely hold a kunai? Of course, then it hit him that he'd been making an enormous oversight since these lessons had begun. He'd assumed the Whirlpool curriculum was the same as Konoha's. Not once had he entertained the thought that Kushina could have skills beyond what was taught in the academy, or that her ineptitude with all these subjects might not translate to an ineptitude of all subjects. So, what techniques do you know? He asked her. She looked at him with wide eyes, the green turquoise color all the more pronounced after her tears. He knew he was the first person to ever ask her that, and the sudden change in her was nothing short of miraculous. Her perpetual scowl melted away into bubbling excitement as she rushed to rise. I can do taijutsu, she said. Minato would beg to differ. He'd been showing her taijutsu stances and techniques for 3 weeks and she'd yet to demonstrate even a correct ready stance. Okay, he said, willing to humor her. He was desperate for anything at this point. She assumed a stance, but it wasn't like any he'd seen in the academy curriculum, where students were taught to brace their feet apart and draw their hands into loose fists. Kushina's pose by contrast was very feminine, there was no other word for it, and it looked so odd on a girl who strove to otherwise avoid reminding anyone of her femininity. She held one hand up above her head and one out before her, and balanced on one foot. She was as poised as a heron before a strike. After a moment she executed a series of moves against an invisible opponent, and Minato noted that she fought low to ground and mostly used kicks instead of punches, utilizing her greater lower body strength. But overall there were a lot of unnecessary flourishes and turns, as if she was dancing instead of fighting, and although it was unexpected enough to take a few enemies by surprise, she was expending way more energy than necessary. When she finished the kata, he asked, why didn't you show that to the instructors? I did, she repeated with exasperated patience. They said it wasn't to standard. I would have to relearn it all your way. And by your way, she meant Konoha's way, a way she had no doubt scorned from the very beginning. It was clear that if she couldn't do taijutsu her way, she wouldn't do it at all. How maddening. When you retake your exams, you should definitely do it your way, however you like, he told her. But you can probably improve it. You're using a lot of energy. I know. My instructors told me I had much higher energy and chakra levels than anyone else in the academy, so they taught me this particular style. It was best suited for me. It's very pretty, but it's not totally practical. It's fine for me, she said loudly. Okay, he replied meekly, not wanting to argue over it. He was just relieved that she knew more taijutsu than he originally could have hoped. What about ninjutsu? She formed a few seals and slashed her palm at the alley wall beside them. A large gash in the brickwork appeared. The first thing we're taught in Waterfall is our elemental affinity, and everything we learn is based on that. Swapping logs around and making clones that any half-wit can see through is for babies. That's not ninjutsu. She showed him more, a technique for blowing high-velocity winds from her mouth that could potentially blow opponents away if she could somehow make it a little stronger, and another that drew them in. She could create, out of nothing, a smoke screen to hide herself, and even showed him she could create a miniature hurricane in the alley, and swore she could make one 10 times bigger if they had the space, and given her boast about possessing an abnormally high level of chakra, he was prepared to believe her. This is great, he said to her. Since I've got a wind affinity too, I can show you even more advanced stuff, like how to make wind clones. I swear, if you can pull off a wind clone in the exam, you'll have the examiners eating out of your hand. You'll be a genin in no time. I already told you, she huffed, I am a genin. Yes, but now you'll be a Konoha genin. I suppose that's the only kind of genin that counts, huh? She sneered sarcastically. Well, he began slowly. Whirlpool doesn't exist anymore, so if you want to become a chunin, you have to go through Konoha's system from the beginning too. Whirlpool still exists. She broke in, outraged. He shrugged, bemused by her sudden anger. No, it doesn't. You've heard the news the same as anyone else. There's nothing left over there. The village was torn down and everyone who remained there was slaughtered. The only part of Whirlpool that's left is you and the other survivors, and they're happy to be part of Konoha, so why aren't you? Hot tears stood out in her eyes. You're a pig. She raged. A horrible, horrible beast. Forget these lessons, I don't want to see you again. I don't want to be part of Konoha if it's full of people like you, but leave me alone. She turned and ran away down the alley, disappearing into the bright sunshine of the street beyond. Minato stood, stumped and dismayed, but steadily growing irritated. Typical, he thought. Just as she was showing promise beneath this well-preserved front of the village idiot, she had to blow another fuse and retreat on all the progress they'd made. Girls. They were such an overly emotional waste of time. At least he figured he knew at least one person who would sympathize. And then she just ran off, shouting that she never wanted to see me again. Sensei, I don't think I can teach her anything. She doesn't want to be a part of Konoha. All I did was tell her the truth and she just blew up. His sensei wasn't really attending. They were both crouched behind the chimney pots of a civilian house, and though Minato had nothing better to do than pick at the lichen on the roof tiles, Jiraiya was peering around the corner with a small handheld periscope. The women's bathhouse was just a few hundred meters away on the other side of the roof. I don't know what to do. Should I go after her? Minato asked. Oh, yes. Never give up on a lady, Minato. Half the thrill is in the chase. Oh, that's right, madam, stretch up those arms nice and high, Jiraiya chuckled, jotting something down in his notebook. I'm not seeing where the thrill is here, Minato said slowly. I can't say anything to her without getting my head bitten off, probably because you're not being very sensitive. What? After a moment Jiraiya took his eye away from the periscope and returned to lean back against the chimney beside him. His wooden Geta shoes clacked against the terracotta tiles beneath them. What was it you said to her again? Just that she doesn't have a village left anymore. Ah, yes, and that all the people who didn't get out were slaughtered, his teacher repeated, which almost certainly included her parents. Right? She was an orphan when she arrived, wasn't she? Yes, but... Minato hedged, feeling cold and clumsy all of a sudden. I was only trying to tell her that she can't keep scorning this village forever. It's the only home she's got now. Also very true, Jiraiya agreed. But try to make her see that fact without mentioning slaughter or making it sound like she has to sacrifice her Whirlpool identity. Imagine if Konoha was invaded and destroyed tomorrow and you got out but your beloved sensei, didn't. Wouldn't it horrify you for someone to speak so flippantly of my death and demand you give up all hope and attachment to Konoha? Minato thought for a moment. You'd never die. Humor me, I guess. I was a little insensitive, he sighed, slowly resolving himself to finding her and apologizing. He didn't know what he'd do if Konoha up and disappeared tomorrow, and though he didn't really understand what it was like to lose parents since his father was still lingering on bitterly and he didn't really remember his mother, the thought of losing his sensei was painful. It couldn't have been easy for Kushina to lose everything. Even if he thought she had chosen a very unnecessarily negative way of dealing with her predicament, he knew he had to go easy on her. Jiraiya was laughing again. See? Girls aren't so hard to understand. I thought you said they exist to confuse us. They do, but when you're as experienced as me with the fairer sex you learn how their minds work, and you're learning from a master. You'll be a regular little ladies' man soon enough. Why would I want to be a lady man? Minato asked tiredly. No, a ladies' man, Minato. And that's why, his sensei said, suddenly seizing him by the shoulders and pulling him up to point over the chimney. Behold! Perfection. He said it so loudly, all 20 heads of the naked women bathers turned in their direction with a mixture of surprise, horror and rage. Mostly rage. After a few startled seconds of silence, during which Minato could have sworn his nose started to run, the women began shouting obscenities and grabbing everything close to hand to throw at them. Some of them were ninja and their aims were deadly accurate. All of a sudden student and teacher were slipping and sliding away down the roof tiles while a hail of soap, rocks, and buckets rained down around them. Minato landed first on the street and flung himself back to take shelter in a doorway. Laughing, Jiraiya landed after him and grinned. "Oh, hey, did you get hit?" "Sorry about that, I thought you knew when to duck by now." "Ah." Minato wiped the stream of blood under his nose, pretty sure he hadn't been hit at all. "I need to go find Kushina. Best of luck, my boy. Remember what your master said and she'll be putty in your hands." But not for the first time Minato had the muteness that if his sensei knew half as much about women as he claimed, they wouldn't always be throwing stuff at him. Rubbing his nose on his sleeve, he ran away through the streets, intending to find Kushina and put things to right. The fact that he didn't know where she lived wasn't a problem. Like the other orphan refugees from Whirlpool, she would have been housed with the social service center when she arrived. Although it was doubtful she was still staying there, they would at least know where she had been placed. The center was a little rundown, fronted by a yard that was filled mostly with gravel and broken toys that were bleached with years of outdoor use. As always, the door was wide open for lack of air conditioning, and a smell wafted through it like something pretty unpalatable was being cooked inside. Minato went right inside, passing through narrow, badly lit corridors with damp, peeling walls that probably hadn't been painted for 50 years. He nearly jumped when a young woman opened the door he was passing. She jumped a little too, and stared at him through her spectacles. "Ah, are you one of the new boys?" she asked uncertainly, clearly trying to remember if she should know him. "No, I'm just looking for someone," he said. "There's this girl called Kushina." "Oh. Her." He'd been fully prepared to launch into a detailed description of what she looked like and where she came from and why he wanted to know where she'd been placed, but apparently the woman knew exactly who he meant and just jerked her hand at him, hinting he should follow her. He did, and as they headed deeper into the center he began to hear the sound of laughing and shouting children, and that awful smell got stronger. It smelled like burning beans. The woman pushed through a set of swinging doors and held it open for him, and Minato found himself stepping into an extremely noisy dining hall. He hadn't realized there were so many homeless, orphan children in Konoha, but from the snippets of voices he could make out, most appeared to have a Whirlpool accent. They were refugees. "She's over there," said the woman, pointing to one of the emptiest tables where a lone figure sat stirring a spoon around her bowl. Minato looked over the same time she looked up, and Kushina stiffened to see him. It was hard to say who was more surprised. Minato hadn't actually thought she'd still be in the social services center after her arrival almost 2 years ago. Suddenly Kushina stood up from the table, grabbed her bowl, and disappeared through a set of doors on the other side of the hall. "She's in a funny mood today," she warned, "and considering it's Kushina, that's saying something." "Are you a friend from school?" "No," Minato said automatically, because never once had he considered their antagonistic relationship even close to resembling the kind of friendship he had with others. And then he felt a little bad, because he knew that he was probably the closest thing to a friend in Kushina's eyes. "Actually," he added. "Yes, I suppose I am." "Well, if you can cheer her up, that would be great," she said, and told him how to get to the dormitory where Kushina had probably gone. She couldn't take him there since she'd spotted a fight breaking out between 2 Whirlpool boys and had to rush over to break it up before everyone got splattered with bean stew. Minato left the dining hall and followed the woman's directions. Sure enough, after going up one flight of stairs he came to a large room lined with almost 30 wire-framed beds, and in the middle of one of the beds he found someone sitting with a white sheet pulled up over her head, finishing her dinner. She ignored him as he entered, pretending that if she couldn't see him then he couldn't possibly see her either. Gingerly, he sat down on the bed beside hers and felt the springs creak and sag beneath him. "I wouldn't sit on Tori's bed, if I were you," she said, from beneath her sheet. "He's a bedwetter." Minato stood quickly. "And don't even think of sitting on my bed," she warned. He hadn't been planning on it. "Is this where you live?" he said, probably a little unwisely, because Kushina's spoon clacked loudly against her bowl like she thinking about throwing them at him. "Sorry, we can't all live in palaces like you," she snapped. She'd clearly never seen his house. But although he'd never thought of his house as a den of luxury, he was beginning to think maybe it was compared to living in this place. And at least he had a chest full of toys and a wardrobe full of clothes, a window of his own and a soft bed. All Kushina had was a cardboard box under her cot with her name on the side, filled with one teddy, a couple of mismatched coloring pens and a thin stack of playing cards. Well, he began, dragging his gaze away from her meager possessions. I didn't think you lived at the center. I told you I didn't have a home. Aren't they supposed to find you one? What do you want? Did you just come round to laugh at me cause I live here because you didn't laugh it up enough that my village was destroyed? I never laughed, he denied, fidgeting awkwardly. I came to say I'm sorry. She cussed at him using words he'd never heard anyone but his sensei use when he was drunk and crashing into things. The bowl of bean stew dropped on the floor and Kushina hurled herself sideways down on the bed, the sheet floating down on top of her like a death shroud. Minato looked uncertainly at the lumpy shape she presented, wondering if she was even open to apologies at this point. I don't think I was very kind, he went on carefully. I didn't mean it like I said it, though. I was just trying to say that for now, at least, what's left of Whirlpool exists in Konoha. Maybe one day they'll rebuild it, but for now can't you accept that this is your home? And if you want to help rebuild Whirlpool again, then you're going to have to become a great ninja, and that's what I'm trying to help you achieve. I'm not trying to make you into a Konoha citizen, I just want you to be able to grow, and then you can be whatever you want to be. The lump beneath the sheet was silent. He wasn't even sure she was breathing, right? He asked. Kushina. Please let me continue tutoring you. And if you really hate me then you won't ever have to see me again once you pass. You're an idiot, she said quietly. You have friends, don't you? That awful skinny girl and that quiet fat boy? I've seen you laughing and playing baseball with that guy who punches me, and those girls who pulled my hair. Everyone likes you. And you're graduated so you could be out taking missions with your team. You could be doing anything you want right now, and I know you hate having to be with me, so why are you bothering? I'm telling you to go away. So just go. I don't hate being with you, he said quickly, because it wasn't true at all. She was tedious and frustrating and hard to talk to, but he didn't hate being around her. You're a liar too. A sudden heat flashed through him like an electric shock, making his head feel unpleasant and tingly. Well, you're dash. He exploded, struggling to articulate his anger. You're not even nice. I've tried so many times to be friends with you, but you're always so rude no matter what I do. He subsided as soon as he said it. He hated getting angry, and he could count the number of times he'd shouted at someone on his left hand. Anger always made him feel sick and tongue-tied, and now he was shaking. So was Kushina. She'd curled into a tighter lump beneath the covers and he could hear her making gasping little breathy sounds that made him feel even worse. I know I'm not. I can't help it. I'm sorry I can't be like you who's so nice even the horrible people are nice back. Now he was sorry he'd ever mentioned it. It's not your fault. Yes, it is. I used to be like those other girls before, and then I realized it was so pointless. I used to have so many friends, but now I can't even keep one, and I don't want friends. I don't even want to be a great ninja. I just want my mom. She dissolved into sobs, clutching the sheets hard around her head as her body shook. Why did they take her? She cried, her voice strained and breaking. She wasn't fighting them, they didn't need to hurt her. Now I'll never see her again. It's not fair, it's not fair, it's not fair. She started to scream. Minato took a step away from the bed, alarmed. Was he supposed to comfort her? Shout for help? He tried placing a hand on her back but she savagely jerked, trying to shake him off, inconsolable with grief and anger. I lost my mom too, he told her, over her sobs. I know what it's like. Kushina surged upright, the sheet flying away to reveal her red, tear-stained face. Did you watch her get dragged away by a gang of reformers? Did you have to crawl through a pit of dead bodies for 2 days until you found her again? And no, he stammered. She died when I was born. Then you know nothing. She screamed at him. If you have nothing, you don't know what it's like to lose it. He couldn't think of what to say to this, only he thought she was probably right. He supposed it was worse to know and love a mother and lose her violently than to not even remember her enough to miss her. That's why I want nothing. I don't want new parents, I don't want a new home, I don't want a new village, and I don't want new friends. I want nothing. Then nothing can be taken away again. But, what's the point in living if you don't have anything to love? He asked. She glowered at him. You're right, I don't know what it's like for you. You've probably had it harder than most of us in Konoha can understand, but I want to understand. I don't think it's right for anyone to be alone. What do you know? She said scornfully, throwing herself down to press her face into his pillow. I know what it's like to be alone, he said. She scoffed, voice muffled. You have a million friends. They like me because I'm a genius, that's all. If I wasn't, they'd have nothing to do with me. I don't know any of them that well and I'd definitely never invite them over to my house. My sensei is the only person I can really talk to, but he's one of the jonin, so he's always busy. He leaves the village for weeks and months sometimes. I know what it's like to hurt and have no one to turn to. So? She said sullenly. So? I don't know. He sighed. He'd argued and defended his point, but he didn't know what it was anymore. He was just glad she'd stopped crying. I don't really remember my mom, but I still like to think that she's still here watching me. Don't be stupid, she grumbled. Only babies believe in ghosts. No, I don't think she's a ghost. I don't even think she's really watching me at all, but I pretend that she is. I do everything the best I can because I want to do the things that would make her happy and proud of me if she was still here. So even if she's gone for good, I still kinda owe it to her to be the kind of person she probably wanted me to be. Kushina sniffed but said nothing. What do you suppose your mother would think if she could see you now? She pounced back up to give him a shocking shove that sent him reeling back onto the bedwetter's mattress. He sincerely hoped they'd changed the sheets that morning already. Don't, she snarled, pretend you know my mother. If she was looking down on me, she'd want me to be sad. Because she's dead. Everyone wants people to be sad when they die. What, forever? Minato asked, picking himself up. She looked uncertain. Obviously not, but, she ran out of words. He tilted his head on one side and watched her curiously fight her mixed feelings. Perhaps he'd gotten through to her, perhaps he hadn't. All he knew was that he'd done all he could. Well, if you want to become a great kunoichi and give her something interesting to watch, I'll be waiting by the river near the gazebo tomorrow, same time as usual. He waited for her to say something, but when all she did was glare glumly at the floor, he parted with another sigh and left. And for once, instead of going to hang around the park with the other boys, or to the ice cream shop owned by AI's mother, who was 10 times kinder than her daughter and never failed to give Minato free samples of the latest flavors, he headed home. His father was out at work and the house seemed even quieter and more gloomy than it usually did. But for once Minato looked at it and appreciated that he didn't have to share a room with 30 other kids and various bedwetters. And when he set off the next morning for the river, he was once again unsure of what he'd find when he got there. The gazebo stood on a small artificial island in the middle of the river, and that was where Minato waited, shoes beside him and feet dangling in the water. The usual time he met Kushina was around 9 o'clock, but the hours slipped by as uneventfully as the leaves floating past on the river's current. Minato began to grow bored. It was looking more and more likely that he'd failed to convince Kushina after all, and he'd have to go tell his sensei and probably the Hokage too, who'd probably reevaluate any previous thought he might have had that Minato was fit to be his successor. And then Minato wondered if he cared. Being Hokage was Jiraiya sensei's idea, not his own, as he was only currently concerned with becoming a ninja, and this thing called puberty that people kept warning him would be coming soon and would do horrible, horrible things to his body. Picking up his shoes, he stepped out onto the water, using chakra to walk on the slippery, moving surface. He couldn't wait here all day, he was going to find his team and join their training. He knew that he should have been relieved, rid of Kushina, he was free to pursue his own interests again, but he didn't feel relieved. He didn't even feel happy. He felt only that he'd let someone down who possibly, or all the people he knew, needed help the most. Can you teach me to do that? He turned sharply to the bank where a scruffy-haired redhead sat, arms around her knees. Oh, was all he could think to say. I didn't think you'd come. She shrugged and looked away from him like it was no big deal, but he realized that to both of them, it was. Sure, I can teach you, he said, smiling. It's easy once you know how. The remaining weeks of the summer passed a little more quickly than he anticipated until there was only a week left until Kushina had to go to the academy to retake her tests. He remained a little worried about her lack of basic jutsu, but he had to remind himself that compared to the beginning of the summer, she had improved a hell of a lot, even if the biggest change had only been in her attitude. As long as he'd been sure to incorporate her elemental affinity into her techniques, she was willing to learn them, even if it was absurd that this meant she picked up something so advanced and specialized as creating wind clones before she'd mastered a simple henge jutsu. Minato had no idea what this meant for her exams, but most of all he was just glad that she appeared to enjoy their sessions a little more, and even he was finding it more challenging than he'd anticipated, what with having to invent brand new wind-based jutsu just to satisfy Kushina's picky requirements. Half the lessons together consisted of Minato himself trying to figure out how to enhance a Kawarimi jutsu with the wind element before Kushina would deign to learn it, and she laughed very quickly at his expense whenever he failed. He didn't mind so much. It was probably the only time she smiled. He even started taking some of Jiraiya's advice as a sensei, and tried to find ways of rewarding his temperamental student whenever she succeeded. Positive reinforcement, his sensei said, was the path to a happy student who was eager to please. Kushina, on the other hand, always found his attempts to reward her highly suspect. "Why are you buying me ice cream?" she said, frowning at the banana split that AI's mother had placed on the bar before her. "Because we made good progress today, and I really fancy ice cream," he said. He didn't want to explicitly say he was rewarding her. Knowing Kushina, she'd take that as patronizing and more evidence of his superiority complex over her, and with just a week left until the exams, he couldn't afford her taking off in another huff. But he also got the feeling that Kushina didn't actually like ice cream that much. So the next day when she pulled off a near-flawless taijutsu kata with far fewer useless flourishes than usual, he asked her, "Are you hungry? Where'd you like to eat?" She just stared at him blankly for a moment, as if scrutinizing the question for criticism or ulterior motives. Then she said, "I like ramen. Ichiraku do nice ramen," he said. "Let's go there." In truth, Minato didn't really like ramen at all. It was watery and bland and he always felt a little sick after a bowl of the stuff, but it was worth it to see Kushina sitting beside him, guzzling down mouthful after mouthful with a pink glow of happiness about her cheeks. And as he was looking at her he noticed something. "What happened to your Hitayate?" he asked. For as long as he'd known her, she'd always worn it, even when the ribbon was down to its last shreds. Kushina reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled it out to show him, though now it was nothing more than a metal plate with the Whirlpool symbol engraved on it. The ribbon had deteriorated completely, and even the plate itself was so scratched it no longer shone and rust was beginning to set in around the edges. "Don't get too happy," she told him. "Just because I'm willing to take the Konoha exams doesn't mean I'm going to give this thing up. Why don't you get a new one engraved?" he asked. "It looks like it's on its last legs." She slipped it back into his pocket. "It was my mother's." "Oh, it was a present?" "No," she said simply, looking sourly at her noodles, joy gone from her cheeks. "I lost mine when I escaped the house. So when I went to the grave." She'd taken it off her mother's body. Minato began to wonder if he had a problem. His foot would keep finding its way into his mouth. It was so difficult to get Kushina to smile, and it only took one misguided question to turn her back into a sharp little stone. He wanted to make it up to her, and he was beginning to get an idea of how. Another issue that seemed to bother her was the fact that he was the one who always paid for the ice cream or the ramen. It wasn't like he had a lot of money to throw around, but he knew Kushina didn't have any at all. He didn't want to draw attention to the fact, but every time it came to paying the bill, it was a forcible reminder of just how different their circumstances were. That would all change once she passed her exams. He wondered if she was a little nervous, or even keen to pass. It was hard to tell with Kushina. He only noticed in those last couple of days before the day of the exam, she seemed to be concentrating twice as hard and listening as if she cared about his advice. On the evening before the exams, they went through a mock trial of all the things she'd be expected to perform. Her henge could have been better, but surely the fact that she could slice open a wall would be taken into consideration when marking her? "I think you'll pass," he said, because although he wasn't sure, he knew often the greatest asset of all was confidence, even if it was false. "You've really nailed some of these techniques. I guess," she said, sitting down against the wall and stirring up a lot of dust in this abandoned shop they'd commandeered for practice. She was out of breath and flushed, and quite obviously tired. Although Minato had been putting in just as much effort, he remained standing, not a hair out of place. This, however, wasn't a bad sign for her chances tomorrow, as a benchmark Namikaze Minato set the standard pretty high. "Are you nervous?" he asked. "Maybe," she said elusively, and her caginess meant she probably was a little bit. As difficult as Kushina could be, he'd never seen her this tense. Suddenly she stopped breathing, her hand in her pocket. He cocked his head at her. "What is it?" "My Hitai 8, she said, patting down her jacket frantically. "It's gone." She stood abruptly, forgetting her fatigue in an instant to smash her palms against every pocket in her clothing. When this yielded nothing, she began to turn on the spot, head darting from side to side as she looked about. "I must have dropped it while we were, where's it gone? I have to find it." "Where is it?" "It's okay, don't worry. I'm sure it'll turn up," he told her. "No, I have to find it." They looked all over the old shop, in every room they'd practiced in, and even a few they hadn't. There were a lot of old boxes and other junk piled up against the walls, and plenty of nooks and crannies for a metal plate to have fallen into and gotten lost, but though they searched for over 30 minutes, they found nothing. Kushina was very upset. Minato looked at her and wondered if she was about to cry. "Maybe you left it at the center?" he suggested. "No, I had it when we arrived here," she said angrily. "It has to be here." "But the light's going," he pointed out, and with the windows half boarded up, the late evening light was fading twice as fast inside the abandoned shop. "We'll look tomorrow. My test is tomorrow. Then we'll look after the test. You'll get it back, Kushina, I promise." She swallowed hard and blinked rapidly, then she nodded grudgingly. She was willing to believe him for now, though it was difficult to convince her to go home and get some rest in preparation for tomorrow. She wanted to come back with a torch and search all night if she had to. And maybe that was what she did, because when he greeted her the next morning outside the gates of the academy, she looked red around the eyes and pale around the lips. "You don't look very fresh," he remarked to her. "Neither do you," she accused. He shifted uncomfortably. "I was busy last night," was all he could tell her. The examiners arrived. Jiraiya arrived too, for this was also a test of Minato's skills as a teacher. And then shortly after that, even the Hokage appeared with his ever-present entourage. With every new arrival, Kushina grew paler and paler. It seemed that, to her, it was a relief when the examiners beckoned for her to follow them into the academy. Everyone else waited outside. Minato, a little shy of the Hokage, made sure to stand where Jiraiya was between them, but that didn't seem to help. "Do you feel she's improved under your tutelage, my boy?" the Sandaime asked him, leaning down to address him. "Maybe. A little. I hope." He wasn't really sure what to say. He hated when he sounded like was boasting, and though he preferred not to make any hasty exaggerations of Kushina's improvement, he couldn't deny that she had improved a lot. Was it fair to take credit for that? Everyone thought Kushina was stupid, and Kushina had been too proud to condescend to Konoha ways and prove otherwise, but almost everything she was now going to show those examiners were things she'd already known. All Minato had done was try to show her that she could keep the way she'd learned in Whirlpool and try to mix it with the things they'd taught her in Konoha. It hadn't taken much talent on his behalf, it had simply been the case that after a while, Kushina had been willing to listen to him in a way she'd never listened to the instructors. So perhaps Jiraiya was right. As paltry as Kushina's attempts at friendliness were, it was possibly the case that she liked Minato more than anyone else in the village. He waited anxiously, biting his lip and listening to the adults talking idly between themselves. How was Kushina doing in there, he wondered. Had they asked her to perform a hench yet? If they had she gotten the face right? Faces were always her weakest point. Only 15 minutes later, Kushina emerged from the academy with the instructors. He searched her face as she approached for any sign of joy or sadness that might indicate if she'd passed or not, but her face was carefully neutral. She stopped a few feet from him, looking back at his expression stolidly. "Well?" he asked, looking from her to the examiners for a clue. Kushina turned slightly and pointed to the black band tied around her upper arm. The symbol of the leaf glinted on the metal plate sewn into it. "You did it!" he cried, grinning broadly, and she smiled faintly in return. "Well done, I knew you could do it," Jiraiya said, though it was Minato's shoulder he clapped and Minato he smiled at. "Congratulations, my girl," the Hokage said after a brief word with the examiners. "They tell me you passed with flying colors, above average, I dare say." "Minato, that's quite an achievement, but you better be careful. If you get too good at this we'll be asking you to tutor the rest of your summers away." His entourage was smiling too and trading knowing looks with one another. They murmured their own praises and commented once more that they would continue to be interested in his progress. Hands patted his head and his shoulders. Someone shook his hand. He blushed and bore it, and when his eyes found Kushina again, she seemed to be standing so far away, and no longer smiling. No one was patting her on the head, or taking her by the hand. Unnoticed by everyone else, she was beginning to turn, about to walk away. Minato slid away from the adults who were now talking amongst themselves and jogged to intercept her. "Congratulations," he said. "You did it all yourself, whatever they think." "Whatever," she said, as if she didn't care what anyone thought. Although from the way her eyes were a little bright, he doubted this attitude was an honest one. "I got you a present," he said, reaching into his pouch to show her what he'd been working on last night. Her mouth dropped open and she stilled when she saw it. My Hitayate," she whispered, but unlike before, it had been relaid upon a new, pristine white strip and its dull, scratched-up surface had been oiled and cleaned of rust. Kushina's hand hovered above it, as if she was afraid to take it. Then suddenly her jaw clenched and that hand curled into a fist. The next thing he knew, she'd thumped him in the stomach the exact same way she had when they'd first met. Her punches were as hard as ever. Winded, he dropped to the ground. The adult stopped talking and looked over. "You beast!" she cried, furious tears running down her face. "You took it from me. I was worried sick, I searched all night. I thought I'd lost it forever. You, she took a deep shaking breath. "You even got the rust off. I fixed it for you," he rasped, pushing himself gingerly to his feet again. "So now you can wear both Konoha and Whirlpool together. Right?" Big wet eyes widened on him. "Here." He reached out, pressing the plate over her forehead and reaching over her shoulders to tie the ribbon into a secure knot behind her head. The white ribbon suited her. Her scruffy red bangs seemed all the more vibrant next to it. When he stepped back, he prepared for another punch, as she'd done the first time he put her Hitayate back on after the academy bullies had thrown it up on the bakery roof. But this time her face had crumpled slightly with tears she was determined to hold back. "Thank you," she said, though she whispered it so quietly he hardly heard her. Then very suddenly she threw herself at him. For a split second he thought he was under attack, until he realized she was only hugging him. A lot of girls did that to him, but for Kushina to do it was a shock to still most beating hearts. He took a sharp breath and inhaled a mouthful of red hair. She drew back quickly. "Sorry," she said, red-faced and touching the hair he'd almost choked on. "I need to cut it." "No, it's okay," he said, still getting over the shock of being embraced, and trying to ignore how his sensei was leering at him, eyebrows waggling. "I like it long." And little did he know that from that day forward, Uzumaki Kushina vowed never to cut her hair again. Chapter 3, A Test of Courage. At age 12, the world was at Namikaze Minato's feet, and it was a world of lost pets, tedious escorts, and hand-harvesting rice, for this was the nature of most D-class missions. I moaned endlessly, complaining that their talents were being wasted, and Saburo said nothing as usual. Minato, however, enjoyed every minute of it. Although he knew he was capable of taking higher-class missions and knew that his sensei was wheedling away at the Hokage to allow him to accept a few C-class scrolls, Minato was content with whatever was doled out. Yes, finding lost pets was a little insulting for ninja, but he liked animals and he loved hide-and-seek, so it was an afternoon of fun and games as far as he was concerned. And yes, being employed by short-staffed farmers who needed their rice crops brought in was a menial but physically demanding task requiring little skill and a spine of steel. But patience was another virtue that shinobi had to master, and he saw the days out on the majestic paddies as close to spiritual honing as he was likely to get. Most of all he enjoyed the escort missions. The clients came in all shapes and sizes and numbers and their only request was to get safely from point A to point B. Minato liked these missions because for the first time in his life he was being allowed to travel extensively outside the village, and he had the opportunity to learn the layout and landscape of the Fire Country. To the north were the mountains, to the west were the rainforests, and in the east lay the swamps while the south boasted the most fantastic beaches. But mostly he liked how long it took them away from Konoha. It was a joy to go to sleep every night in a tent beside his sensei, eat breakfast with his teammates, and play games with them to pass the time as they traveled through the day. He was never lonely. He certainly never felt homesick. Sometimes he thought he would be glad to get home again and see his other friends and sleep in the comfort of his own bed. But one cold silent evening around the dinner table with his father was enough to remind him that sleeping on the cold ground was a small price to pay to get away from such stifling silence. But as small as Minato's world was at 12, it was rapidly expanding. Genin were not normally brought into war, and if they were it was only to handle tasks on the periphery where there was no contact with the enemy. But Konoha had, for a long time, been at war with Kyomo and AIM, and tensions were deepening as battles became more embittered. Soon their team was being tasked with missions closer to the contended borders. Most of the time it was just a matter of taking messages back and forth as quickly as possible, and it wasn't nearly as easy as it sounded. One of the enemy's biggest priorities was to intercept the communication of the opposition, and sometimes messengers disappeared between the village and the border. More than once Minato had fought off much older and larger enemy Nin who thought taking a scroll from him would be as easy as stealing candy from a baby. He disliked killing, and he avoided it when he could, but Jiraiya had cautioned him that mercy at the wrong time would be his greatest weakness. By the time he was 13, he'd already killed 11 men. Since he would not brag about this, I did it for him whenever the young teenage genin congregated around the bridge to loiter, kick stones, flirt, and trade mission stories. What do they look like when they die? Asked a pale blonde boy called Inoichi who had a rather gruesome thirst for details. I hear your eyes bug out and your tongue swells up when you get killed. Is that true? What did your first time feel like? Minato shrugged. He hadn't really thought about these questions before or the subjects. His first time had felt like nothing. The man had been alive one moment and then he'd stopped moving and breathing and he'd been dead, but Minato had felt very little, neither sadness nor relief, and not even shock. It was the 7th man he'd killed that had perturbed him, as this was the first time he'd killed a man attempting to retreat. He'd felt a little bad about that. But as for what it looked like, sometimes their eyes bugged out. Sometimes they went purple in the face before they stopped moving. Sometimes their bowels opened and it was deeply unpleasant to watch, but other times it was almost like they had just fainted, cleanly, neatly, without ever knowing what was happening until they were gone. Isn't it scary, fighting with people who might kill you? Asked Mikoto, a young kunoichi from the Uchiha clan. Ai slung her arm around his shoulders so roughly that he swayed and staggered. Why should he worry when he's got me to look out for him? She laughed. Are you two going out or something? Inoichi asked, pointing at them skeptically. Don't be gross. Ai pulled a face at him. He's going out with that awful girl, what's-her-face? Kagura, Minato sighed. Yuzui Kagura. Wait, Kagura from Tsukumo-sensei's team? The one who went out with Big J? Have you done it yet? Inoichi. Ai screeched. Pervert, what? It's a fair question. Minato shrugged. We hold hands sometimes, he said. So you haven't even kissed her yet? We've only been going out a month. You've been going out a month and you still haven't kissed her? Minato helplessly shrugged again. To be honest, he was only going out with Kagura because she'd asked and he sort of liked her and thought she was pretty, but the dating ritual still left him bemused. It seemed pointless. They didn't get to see each other much, and when they did have the time to get together it was embarrassing because the moment anyone saw them together they would be teased and jeered mercilessly. He couldn't go over to her house because she thought her family was embarrassing, and he definitely didn't want her coming over to his house because his father was excruciating. I heard she did it with Big J already, Inoichi said, to a round of sniggers. Oh, right, according to J. Ai snorted. He's a big fat liar. He said he did a C-class mission all by himself, but that turned out to be bullshit too. And he said he felt up that Whirlpool girl with the big tits. As if, Inoichi agreed. Oh, no, that was true. How else do you think he broke his arm? Worth it, though, said Inoichi. I'd risk a broken arm too just for a chance to squeeze those lovelies. Pervert, Ai hissed. Anyway, that bitch will break your arm as soon as look at you. She's horrible. She's not horrible, Minato said quietly. Oh, I forgot. You love her, don't you? Ai rolled her eyes at him. I hope Kagura knows you're two-timing her with that Whirlpool slut. Is that true? You fancy Uzumaki? Inoichi smirked. Really? I don't think she's horrible, that's all. I don't fancy all the people I don't think are horrible, said Minato, his ears feeling unusually warm. And they're even on the same team, Ai went on, ignoring him. How awkward. And look, here they come now. Minato glanced over his shoulder and realized why the subject of his girlfriend and Kushina had been foisted on him so abruptly. They were coming down the road towards the bridge, accompanied by their sensei and the third member of their team. They must have been returning from a mission, since they were all, save for Tsukumo-sensei, walking in a weary, weaving sort of way, all bowed under the weight of the backpacks they were carrying. Kagura looked up and seemed to instantly rejuvenate when she saw Minato. She straightened and waved, and broke into a jog to catch up to the group on the bridge before the rest of her team. "What are you guys up to?" And, as if none of them had been speculating at all on whether or not she'd put out for Big J, they shrugged and smiled blandly back at her. Inoichi was smiling a little more broadly than anyone else, and this was because he wished he was the one going out with Kagura, but being pretty and popular meant it was hard to find a window of opportunity between one boyfriend and the next. "You just got back from a mission?" Minato asked, letting her take his hands and sway them from side to side, regardless of the sniggers behind them. "Yeah, it was a nightmare," she said with a roll of her eyes. "How come?" he asked. "Three guesses," she muttered, and glanced towards her team, or more specifically, towards Kushina. Minato didn't know exactly what had happened, but he could make a pretty good guess that it had involved a lot of mud, since a lot of mud had involved itself with Kushina. She was caked in the stuff, from the tip of her toes to her elbows. It was in her hair, on her face, and her culottes had probably changed color completely and would never be the same again. Minato watched her in amazement, but she didn't even spare him a glance as she passed. She rarely did when there were others around. "Oi, Kushina," Inoichi called, "how can you stand straight with those things?" Beside him, Ai made a gesture like she was juggling two watermelons in front of her chest. Kushina neither paused nor looked at any of them, she just kept walking. The abuse seemed a little unwarranted, however, Minato thought. Although it was hard to tell because she insisted on wearing baggy, shapeless clothes, her breasts didn't seem that big, although it seemed like only yesterday she'd been as flat as him. She was an early and very fast bloomer, and unfortunately for her, this singled her out even more as a target of male fascination and female envy, and either way this manifested in nasty ways. But of course, as Tsukumo-sensei passed, Inoichi and Ai were full of nothing but angelical smiles. He was one of the scarier teachers, tall, with long white hair pulled into a ponytail and a faint limp. A lot of the genin thought this jonin was some kind of reformed bandit, especially when he was wearing his mask. "Don't you kids have training to do?" he grunted, glaring suspiciously at them as if he knew their every sin just by glancing at them. "Kagura! Get a move on." Kagura hastily dropped Minato's hands and hurried away. Not for the first time Minato was glad his sensei was pleasant and easygoing and not at all like Hatake Tsukumo, and he wondered if Kushina was happy being part of his team. He'd have to ask next time he saw her, though who knew when that would be. This was how it was for all the academy children. Once you graduated, you were split up into teams under a jonin teacher if you weren't already, and then you began taking separate missions. There were some classmates he hadn't even seen since the academy days. Although he'd been pleasantly surprised by Kushina, he'd never been certain of where they stood. Were they friends? Just acquaintances? As soon as she'd been placed within her own team, she'd been whisked away, and the sudden absence of her company after a summer full of it left him feeling a little insecure. He'd approached her team during practice once, but she'd been so cold towards him in the presence of others that it was Kagura he ended up chatting with more easily and fluently until he gave up bothering since visiting Kushina during training because it was becoming more a matter of visiting Kagura instead. It was easier when he caught her on her own. When there were no other people around she suddenly seemed to notice him and respond, even if it never with much warmth. No matter what he did, she was always wary of him, as if she suspected every overture of pleasantness on his part to be part of some underhanded plan to humiliate her. He'd talked about that with Jiraiya-sensei, who had said that people like Kushina who were teased a lot tended not to trust others so easily, though Minato felt that her standoffish attitude and weird manners brought her a lot of unnecessary grief, that in turn made her even more weird and introverted, which brought on more teasing, and so on, in a vicious circle. It made it seem all the more important to be nice to her, but it was quite difficult when he got the feeling she was doing her best to avoid him on some days. She probably didn't care that much about their friendship as his sensei insisted. Perhaps Kushina had never really liked him that much and now she was just glad to be free of him. Their brief friendship of sorts was over, and now she was just another of his many casual acquaintances who over time faded away. At least, that was what he warned himself the case might be, and that didn't explain the ludicrous swell of pleasure he felt in his middle when, later that same day, he was resting beneath a brick wall near the training grounds and Kushina's face appeared, peeping down at him over the top of the wall. Granted, she nearly gave him a heart attack at the same time, but mostly he was glad to see her. And with no one else around, there was no one to chase her off. "Minato," she said, "Kagura says you killed someone last week." Yeah, he said, blowing a lock of hair off his sticky forehead. It was desperately hot that particular day. How many is that now? She asked. 11. Weird, she said, pulling herself up and over the wall to drop down beside him. She still smelt strongly of bog mud, and a lot of it was still crusted in her shoes, though she'd clearly made an effort to change her clothes and scrub it off her skin. He guessed she only had one pair of shoes after all. What's it like? What? He'd been too busy examining her shoes to catch her meaning. To kill someone. What's it like? He'd already been asked this 1,001 times by the other genin who had yet to experience it, and so far he'd been moved to act as everyone expected him to act, cool and indifferent. I don't really like it, he said heavily, not caring if she thought him less than perfectly stoic, because who was Uzumaki Kushina going to tell about it? Most of it was self-defense, and I did it without thinking, and at the time all I feel is relief and satisfaction. Then I remember they're only people doing what they were told to do, like me. Kushina watched his face intently. Some people deserve to die though, don't they? Do they? He wondered. What about the reformists? Who are they? The people who tried to take over my village. They killed loads of people because they didn't like how things were being run. If I tracked them down and killed them, I don't think I'd feel too guilty about it afterwards, she said decisively. Is that what you plan to do? She wrinkled her nose. Nah. I can't remember what any of them look like anyway. But if anyone turns up to interfere when I start rebuilding the village, I'll give them what for. Minato grinned, because he suddenly had an image in his head of feisty little Kushina lobbing planks of timber around, literally rebuilding her village, brick by brick. The real Kushina scowled at him apprehensively. She always thought mirth was at her expense. How do you plan to rebuild your village anyway? He asked her. You'd need to start having kids very early if you're going to repopulate it just by yourself. Children? EW. If it's made nice again, people will return there of their own accord, won't they? And maybe it'll be so good that they'll make me Kage. Minato could have pointed out that this was unlikely, as a Kage usually had to be the strongest person in the village, and the village had to be one of the 5 great villages belonging to one of the 5 states controlled by a recognized daimyo, which Whirlpool never had been and would likely never be, even if by some miracle it was returned to its former glory. But being bluntly realistic with Kushina never went down well. Instead, he smiled and nodded, for even if Kushina would never be a Kage, there was no harm in dreaming. You'll have to train hard under your sensei then, he told her. What do you take me for? She asked hotly. I've been learning loads with Tsukumo sensei. He's really cool and knows loads of stuff, and he tells Kagura off all the time, so. She stopped suddenly and bit her lip as a faint pink spread across her cheeks. Whatever she'd been planning to say was gulped down in an audible swallow. I heard he was really strict, Minato said. Kushina was outraged that anyone could dare criticize her sensei. Yeah, well, Tsukumo sensei says Jiraiya sensei isn't nearly strict enough. Minato gasped. There's no better teacher than Jiraiya sensei. He protested. My sensei could kick your sensei's ass any time. Kushina declared, arms crossed in mighty defiance. Oh yeah, well. Minato struggled for a comeback. Verbal battles were never his strongest point. My sensei was taught by the Hokage. Mine is better looking. No, he isn't. Yes, he is. Oh, who cares about looks? It's all about how many missions they've. Mine's done more. No, he hasn't. Yes, he has. This girl really was infuriating. You can't just say he has when he hasn't. Minato cried. I've seen the records. Jiraiya sensei has. The records are wrong, Kushina said dismissively, unrepentant in her disregard for logic or the increasing splutters issuing forth from Minato. Any further debate on the matter was ended by a girlish holler from the other end of the pavement. They both looked over and saw AI jogging down the path towards them. Minato stood to greet her, but was slightly shocked when, without seeming to notice Kushina, AI threw her arms around his neck, suddenly enough to make him stagger. There you are. She cried gleefully. Where have you been? I've been looking all over for you, you sneaky boy. Come on. I have to show you something. Kushina seemed to melt against the wall, becoming more invisible next to AI's vivaciousness. Minato caught her eye. I'll see you later, okay? He told her, because he was already being jostled along the path by his teammate who still didn't seem to have noticed she'd interrupted anything. With a small nod and a stony face, Kushina scuttled back over the wall and out of sight. With Kushina gone, AI transformed as she dragged him away along the pavement. No longer grinning, she turned to look back at the place where the other girl had disappeared as if to check she was really gone. She didn't drop her arm from around Minato's neck. "Why do you hang out with her?" she asked critically. "Why shouldn't I?" he asked, genuinely wanting to know. Hello? She makes you look bad." "Oh, so ditch her and start hanging out with you real friends, Minato," she jostled him again. That was the problem with her being a little taller. Despite being 10 times as lethal as her, she always treated him like a little kid. "I'm not worried if I look bad," he said. "What if I tell Kagura you're spending more time with the immigrant than with her? So I can't have female friends if I'm going out with a girl?" "Pretty much." He twisted out from under her arm and changed direction, walking away from her. "Oi!" she shouted after him. "Sorry," he said, "I can't be friends with you anymore because..." "That's different. We're not friends, we're teammates." He turned with a smile. He'd only been teasing her, but it was fun watching AI get angry when normally she was the only running rings around everyone else. "What was it you wanted to show me, AI?" When Minato came to knock on his sensei's door the following day, a bear answered. Well, it wasn't really a bear, but Jiraiya-sensei could look awfully frightening first thing in the morning when he hadn't yet washed and dressed and his hair was loose. Scratching his belly through his pajamas, he yawned down at Minato and stood for a moment trying to remember who he was. His sensei was a very tall man, easily the tallest jonin in the village. No wonder it was so difficult to hide himself from the women he stalked. "Ah," said the bear at last in a deep, croaky rumble. "Minato. Come in. Have you had breakfast yet?" That wasn't the reason he'd come, though he was never one to turn down an offer of free food, especially when his sensei always kept such indulgent treats in his fridge. Most people had plain food for breakfast: toast, cereal, eggs, etc. Not Jiraiya-sensei. He had chocolate gatto. So as Minato happily stuffed cake into his cheeks like a delirious hamster, his sensei dressed. By the time he returned to the kitchen, Minato had wolfed down at least 3 slices. "AI told me you entered us into the Chunin exam," he said, before his sensei would notice half his cake was absent. "That I did. I thought you didn't want to enter us yet," Minato said. One of the most common things his sensei said was let children be children, and while some teachers pushed to have their students pass into the ranks of Chunin, mostly just to be rid of them, it seemed, Jiraiya had hung on to them, saying physical maturity always came before mental maturity. While he was confident his kids could pass the test, he didn't think they needed to just yet. Or at least that had been true until AI had taken Minato to the administration headquarters and showed him the list of exam applicants. "Perhaps it's time, Minato," his sensei said, sounding a little weary, although that was probably because it was Monday morning. "I can't hold you back forever and most of your peers will be entered this year. I think the Triad of Doom are entering, even Hataki's entering his kids." While it was a given that Inoichi and his team, or the Triad, as some called it, as the relationship between the Yamanaka, Nara and Akimichi clan bordered on mafia-like, the news that Kushina was entering gave him a jolt he felt right in the pit of his stomach. Was she really ready for this kind of thing? It wasn't so much the exam he worried about, but rather what would happen if they passed. "I wasn't sure about AI and Subiru," his sensei went on. "But I figure if you're ready, they are too, though it'll be no walk in the park once you're Chunin. It means taking orders from other Jonin, and I won't be able to keep you off the front lines anymore." This was of no concern to Minato. He'd been near enough the front lines to make no difference. He knew it was hard out there on the edge, and extremely dangerous, but he'd never even felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of sending and retrieving messages near even the bloodiest Kyomo border. But what about Kushina? It seemed like only yesterday she was wrinkling her nose, struggling to perform the most basic of henge. "Tsukumo-sensei isn't pushing his students too hard, is he?" he wondered hesitantly. Jiraiya blinked at him in surprise. "What makes you say that?" "It's just that I heard he's really strict." "Tsukumo? He's a pussycat." "But Minato, he's a very kind, fair man once you get to know him. He wouldn't have entered your Kushina into the exam unless he was confident she could handle it." "Am I Kushina?" That sounded wrong on so many levels. But something else had been bothering him too. Sensei. If there was a fight between you and Tsukumo-sensei, who would win?" "Minato!" Jiraiya cried, alarmed. "How could you ask that?" Minato dropped his head in shame. Of course your sensei would win, what do you take me for? But it was not to be. As it turned out, Minato's innocent question planted a seed of uncertainty in his sensei, and by the end of the week, news was spreading fast around the village that a certain powerful jonin had challenged another powerful jonin in a fight to the death. Konoha gossip was known to be a little exaggerated. Nevertheless, the moment Minato heard it, he raced to the third training ground to join the mass of spectators who'd already congregated to watch the two jonin teachers go at each other. It was flashy and very fast, and most would agree it was hard to follow, as the two men pulled only their most fatal punches, everything else they let loose freely. Over the cheering encouragement of the crowd, Minato picked out one little redhead hopping along the sidelines, the most bloodthirsty of them all. She was quite clearly instructing her sensei to rip the head off Minato's sensei, but in the kind of language that never failed to make him blush. When the fight ended, it looked to the untrained eye that the two men were evenly matched and had drawn equally. Yet from the wincing of his sensei and the strained kind of smile he showed, Minato knew this draw was just a polite way to end a fight that both their reputations had ridden on. In reality, Jiraiya sensei had lost. That seemed impossible to Minato. He was in more shock and denial than his own sensei at this defeat. But what he failed to understand then, as he wouldn't understand until he was older, was that his sensei was still a boy of 23, and Kushina's sensei had 10 years of age and experience on him, including a legendary title and the motivation of a lovely, 4-month pregnant wife among his spectators. Minato was nearing his 14th birthday when the next scheduled Chunin exam was finally held. At the time, it was strictly a domestic affair. Every village held its own Chunin exams, and how difficult it was varied from country to country. It would be many years before the Third Secret War ended, and it would become an international event and a manner of keeping the peace. For Minato and the other genin, it was all about war. Spies were sent to observe the developments and results of the Chunin exams in other villages, for the greatest way to measure a rival's potential was to see the new talent. This was probably why everyone was suddenly very excited about Minato. As far as reputation went, he was only really known in Konoha, but Jiraiya was of the opinion that once these exams were over, there wouldn't be a Kage in all the 5 nations who didn't know his name and at least fear it a little. With a little trepidation at the thought of foreign leaders talking about him, Minato signed up along with the rest of his team, Aki and Subiru. It seemed fairly simple. There would be 3 exams, the first testing cognitive skills, the second testing physical skills, and the third would be a rounded free fight contest to demonstrate combat skills, utilizing every skill the genin had. This year there were 20 applicants hoping to be promoted. At 9:30 on the day of the examination, they congregated in an old academy hallway that none of them had been in for at least 2 years, and where the first test was to take place. Until the examiners arrived, they had little to do but fiddle about in their seats and nervously check out the competition. When the others saw Minato, they began looking a little green. He even heard a few people muttering that if they got placed opposite him in the final, they'd just drop out to save face. Minato didn't share in any of their nervousness as he glanced around at the other genin, but then it would be a distant day before he ever met his match in Konoha. He did, however, do a small double take when he saw Kushina sitting 6 chairs away from him, studiously examining the children's pictures on the opposite wall. She was alone, without her teammates, which meant they'd either chickened out of applying or, as was usually the case, their sensei had deemed them unready. "Kushina," he called, waving at her. "Hey, Kushina." Her eyes flicked once to him and then quickly away. She was ignoring him. Before he even knew what to think of that response, the examiner emerged from the classroom before them. "Now that we're all here," she announced to the rapt genin, "we'll proceed with the first test. When I call your name, you'll be taken into the classroom where the test will be explained to you, and you will each have 15 minutes to complete the set task. Upon finishing, you will be asked to wait outside in the training yard as you are not to discuss the test with other students waiting to take it." "Understood." There was a nervous mutter of agreement. Some genin were absolutely frozen in dread and unable to even nod. "We'll do this alphabetically," the Chunin examiner said. AI stood, looking determined and scared, and marched into the room like a lioness. The door shut behind her, and though it was obvious that everyone was bursting to talk, the presence of the imposing examiner held them in absolute silence. 15 minutes later an AI emerged to curious stares. She was soaking wet. "Go stand outside please," the examiner said. Muttering, and almost literally steaming, AI stomped away down the corridor. Akimichi Chusa, a very large boy, even bigger than Subiru, went into the classroom and after some definite roaring that had most genin flinching, he emerged 10 minutes later with wet arms and sandals that squeaked wetly on the linoleum floor. This was quite the mystery. Just what was going on in that classroom, and what on earth did so much water have to do with testing cognitive abilities? Other genin were looking even more bemused, as one by one they were called forth and one by one they emerged again wearing various degrees of moisture. Some were dripping wet, like AI, and some were only just splattered with a few drops. Some took the full quarter hour, most seemed to finish or give up after 10. After the 15th genin emerged, squelching away in sodden shoes, the examiner finally called his name. Namikaze Minato. Most of the other remaining genin wished him luck as he passed them on his way towards the classroom door, and he wondered if Kushina would say it too. She just looked the other way. Perhaps she felt it was a little unnecessary. Wishing Minato luck in passing a test was not unlike wishing luck for the sun to rise tomorrow morning. Inside the classroom, he took a moment to look around. It was empty, save for 2 tables pushed together against the far wall, upon which sat 2 large tanks, one full of water, the other empty. A little damp note had been pinned to the tabletop between them. Minato read it, and realized the task was simpler than he'd anticipated. All he had to do was transfer water from the first tank into the second, and he would be scored by how much water he managed to retain and how fast he managed to accomplish it. Presumably this was a test of chakra precision and ingenuity, and also of detection abilities. Minato turned his head slightly, noticing the curiously still insect sitting on the window. It was definitely watching him, he thought, as he walked across the room to one corner, and then the other, and saw the fly swiveling on its legs to follow him. He knew that there was a family of ninja in Konoha who used insects as tools and spies, and in all likeliness one had been commissioned by the examination board to make sure there was no cheating. And even though Minato didn't quite consider his idea as cheating, he decided to play it safe, and succinctly flattened the fly with an old textbook and turned to his task at hand. He emerged after 3 minutes and 24 seconds, with just a dab of condensation under his chin that no one noticed, and went to stand out in the yard with all the other quivering genin who saw him and quailed. How did you do it? Yamanaka Inoichi demanded, blonde hair dripping. I was scooping it as fast as I could, but I ran out of time. You weren't using your hands, were you? His teammate Shikaku asked lazily. There was a wastepaper basket in the corner that could hold about 6 liters. Is that what you did? Inoichi demanded, absolutely terrified. Apparently Shikaku was refusing to say. I just lifted up the first tank and poured, said Akimichi Chuza. Even Minato's eyes widened at the thought. That tank full of water was heavier than a champion sumo wrestler. Most of it went on the floor though, Chuza admitted. Uzumaki Kushina was one of the last to emerge, looking surprisingly dry with only a few spots of damp along her sleeves. Minato debated whether or not to go over and ask how she'd attempted to solve the test, but she was moving quite deliberately to stand apart from the crowd of other genin, and when she caught his eye she looked at him like she didn't know who he was. Such a strange girl. The examiners came along a few minutes later with the last genin, who was not only covered in water, but bandages too. Undoubtedly something had unfolded involving the glass tanks, but Minato dreaded to think how he's managed that. That will do, said the stern examiner, as if they were a rabble of noisy children instead of what they really were, which was a silent cluster of frightened genin who strongly resembled a pack of drowned rats. You have all more or less completed the first third of your examination. Here are your results so far, from last place to first place, but be warned that your position now is subject to change depending on how you perform on the next 2 tasks. Last and least is Yohana Soteshi. Did you really think punching the tanks would get you far? The boy with the bandaged hands hung his head. It went on like that, a name being read out followed by some genin wincing and cringing as their disgrace was aired freely before everyone. Most of them appeared to be holding themselves rigid and breathless until around halfway through the list. Anyone who hadn't had their name read out yet at least knew they were in the upper 50%, although the examiner's tone was no less harsh. Abai, she read out, more original thinking using the wastepaper basket. You should have worked faster though. You only transferred half the water volume before you ran out of time. AI scowled, but didn't seem too upset as most people had chosen the same method. A minority had been in possession of an apt jutsu to move the water across, though from the sound of it this was to mixed success. There didn't appear to be anyone who had transferred the water completely without spilling whole pints. And after AI came Uzumaki Kushina. Using the tube from the Bunsen burner to siphon the water was clever, but too small. You should have used the larger tube from the vacuum cleaner if you'd wanted to complete the task on. What? AI exploded. What Bunsen burner? What vacuum cleaner? In the closet, the examiner replied evenly. A good ninja knows to exploit their environment for tools and advantages otherwise overlooked. A good nin, I'm not hearing this, I ground out. I bet she doesn't even know what a siphon is. It's that thing what you use to clean the fish tank. Kushina shouted, red with anger. I bet you've never cleaned anything in your life, you lazy. And good ninja conduct themselves with dignity and restraint, barked the examiner, glaring them both into rapid submission. Nara Shikaku. You switch the tanks around. Ingenious, but if you plan to commit deceit, you must take better care to hide it. And finally she turned to Minato. It was no surprise to anyone in that yard that he was the final student, and therefore the one with the highest score, but there was a little tingle of curiosity from the other genin as they wondered just how Captain Awesome had done it. Namikaze Minato, you disabled the bug, so we don't know how you did it, but you transferred every drop as far as we can tell in less than a third of your allotted time, so we have no choice but to give you a perfect score, she said grudgingly. Thank you, said Minato meekly. Around him, the genin heaved a mixture sigh of envy and dismay that they were still no nearer to learning how he'd done it. That is all, said the examiner. You're all dismissed until tomorrow, when we will start the second part of your test. Finally released, the atmosphere relaxed immediately. Seeing that he was about to be accosted by no less than a dozen impatient genin, Minato furtively turned to search for Kushina. He found her in the process of trying to sneak away herself, only she was having a difficult time of it because Uchiha Mikoto had cornered her. Thinking she was being teased again, he jogged towards them. But it was a false alarm. I wish I'd thought of that, he caught Mikoto saying as he caught up. You know, everyone says you're thick, but none of them thought to look for a siphon. I didn't think we were allowed in the storage closet, so I just used the trash can. Kushina was absolutely dismayed by this attention. She looked at the other girl like she was speaking another language, still discreetly trying to edge away, and when she saw Minato approaching she managed to look even more alarmed. Congratulations, Kushina, you did really well, he told her warmly. Yeah, well, whatever, she mumbled. I have to go. Eyes wide and slack-jawed respectively, Mikoto and Minato watched her hurry away across the training yard and through the gate onto the street. Neither of them had been quite so blatantly blown off in all their lives. Mikoto gave Minato a look of deep consternation. I don't think she likes me at all. This was probably very true, but it seemed unfair. As much as the Uchiha clan had a reputation for being especially combative and antisocial with those outside the clan, the female side of the family had always seemed perfectly normal and pleasant to Minato. Mikoto didn't deserve to be given the cold shoulder. She's very shy, he said apologetically. I'm sure if she knew you a little better. She smiled sadly and turned away, but she didn't seem to know anyone else to talk to, and she stood awkwardly. Minato felt a pang of sympathy. Kushina shouldn't have rebuffed her. I better go home, Mikoto said. My family will be eager to hear how I did. Minato waved her goodbye, then immediately set off after Kushina before anyone else could descend on him. Someone needed to talk to that girl and remind her just how rude she could be, in case she didn't realize it herself, but although he'd set off only moments after her, it took him almost an hour to track her down in the busy village center with its many narrow alleys and crooks and crannies where small redheads from Whirlpool could hide. It was only by chance that he eventually found her, when he was running out of ideas and just wandering through the lower level of the market street. At first he noticed some sort of commotion near one of the stalls. Someone appeared to be convinced it was raining, though there wasn't a cloud in the sky and his customers were telling him he was crazy. I tell you it's raining, he cried, taking off his hat to shake it. It was pretty wet. Minato quickly climbed the steep staircase to the upper level of the market and found Kushina sitting near the rails above the distressed man. She was holding a watering can in her hand and stared at him stolidly, unabashed at being caught red-handed. You shouldn't have done that, he said. It's just a bit of fun, she replied with a shrug, and reached her arm out over the rail to tip the can again. It wasn't the pranks he cared about. I meant about that Uchiha girl. She was trying to be nice to you, and you just turned your back on her. Kushina froze, watering can stopping before it could deposit more than a few dribbling drops. Do you enjoy that? Pushing everyone away so that no one likes you? He asked. She pulled a face but didn't answer, although from the way she set the watering can down beside her it looked as if her heart had gone out of the prank. And why do you like pretending I don't exist when other people are around? He demanded. Are you ashamed of me or something? Ashamed of you? She spluttered. Are you smoking the same stuff as Big J now? I'm doing it for you. He shrugged helplessly. What does that mean? Don't they make fun of you for hanging around with me? She asked. Well, yes, but I don't care. Kagura cares. She never shuts up about it. Sensei makes her run laps around the village if he catches her, but when he's not there she really lays it on thick. Most of the bruises I don't get on missions, she grouched, folding her arms across her knees to prop her chin on them. She stared out moodily over the market. Kagura picks on you? He asked, shocked. Everyone picks on me, she intoned flatly. Yes, but Kagura, I thought she was nice. How strange, to think that someone could be so sweet to his face but be so nasty behind his back to someone else. Was I supposed to tell you she wasn't nice? Kushina wondered, more to herself than to him. I didn't think you'd believe me. It wouldn't have occurred to him to think for a second that Kushina could be lying. Most people would assume that, and would preference their lovely girlfriend over a scruffy immigrant with a potty mouth any day of the week, but Minato felt he knew Kushina better than he did most of his other acquaintances, including his girlfriend. While he knew Kushina could be frustrating and contradictory and downright confusing at times, she didn't lie. I'll dump her if you like. Kushina inhaled deeply and gave a long sigh. Nah. It's okay, she said quietly, as if she didn't care. But it wasn't really up to her. Minato didn't want to go out with anyone who gave bruises to those more vulnerable than themselves. Let's have a look, he said. What? Kushina shot him an annoyed look. She didn't hold with half-formed commands. At these bruises, a little reluctantly, she rolled up one dirty, frayed sleeve and showed him her forearm. He had to peer pretty closely to make out the tiny, faint discoloration in her skin, and 2-minute scratch marks that were nearly finished scabbing. It was an old abrasion, but he still felt bad. To Kushina he gave a solemn, remorseful look. That's awful. Emboldened by his satisfyingly sympathetic response, she turned pink and hastily shifted closer to show him her neck. She had to push down her collar and her dirty, chin-length hair to reveal the red mark hiding there. Minato gave another appropriate gasp of horror. And look, she said, pulling up her jacket almost all the way up to her shoulders to show him her bare back, like these battle scars were a point of pride. Look at this one. Uchiha Mikoto's brother did that one with a stick. There was a rather nasty scab between her shoulder blades that might have once been quite an impressive little cut a week or two ago, but all Minato could focus on right then was that, apparently, Kushina didn't wear bras. That seemed strange, since even AI wore a bra and she didn't even appear to need one yet. Most girls their age already wore them. He swallowed with some difficulty. Even so, he said, trying to force his mind off feminine underwear and its absence. Mikoto doesn't seem so bad. You should try being friends with her. Kushina dropped her jacket back in place, her expression cagey. She grunted unenthusiastically. He realized that he was asking her to do something quite difficult. It's not like she has many friends either, so. Her expression softened. Okay, she said quietly. I'll try and be on my best behavior. I guess she'd have to be pretty desperate for friends if she wants me for one. Don't put yourself down, Minato admonished. Right. There's plenty enough people to do that for me. Yeah, well, self-pity doesn't really suit you, he told her, not when you did really well on that test. Did anyone else think to use a siphon? I don't think so. Kushina drew glum circles on the concrete between them. I was right, I didn't even know what a siphon was. That was just how Mom used to clean the aquarium. I don't know the names for things, but I remember how she did it. That's all that's important, he reminded her. I was lucky. If the test had been different I would have totally failed. You had experience the others like AI didn't have, and whether or not you would have passed if it had been a different kind of test is irrelevant, he said. You were in the top 5, so you should be happy. I bet you didn't think keeping fish would pay off like this eventually, huh? Everyone in Whirlpool had an aquarium, she told him, looking surprised that this wasn't a given. We were right on the coast, had the best reefs in the world that were filled with millions of tiny little colored fish. My favorite were the red ones because they had these beautiful long, ruffled fins. We used to catch them ourselves, so everyone had a tank, though you had to be careful not to get sucked into the whirlpools. I spent every day in the sea back home. But now, I haven't seen the ocean in years. The last whirlpool I saw was in the bath, so she did at least take baths. That was good to know. Minato reached out and touched her shoulder, glad to hear her share something of her past that she clearly remembered fondly. The reefs will still be there, won't they? He pointed out. One day we'll go see them again. Slowly, she smiled back, and her face glowed even under all its layers of dirt. Are you ready for the test tomorrow? He asked. Yep. She nodded, then suddenly went still. Wait. You never said how you got all the water into the other tank without spilling a drop. Oh, he said, looking sheepish. I didn't. You didn't. I didn't move anything. I just put a genjutsu on the examiners to make them think I had. Her mouth dropped open in surprise and she contemplated this audacious move. It had not occurred to her or anyone else to tamper with the examiner's judgment instead of the tank's. That sounds like cheating, she said suspiciously, but you'd have to be pretty good to fool Chunin examiners, so I think you deserve your marks anyway. Thank you, he said humbly. Well, this village seems to encourage and reward dishonesty and all kinds of unwholesome behavior anyway, so it figures you'd pass with flying colors, she said with an indifferent shrug. Now if you'll excuse me. She rose to her feet and calmly tipped the rest of the watering can's contents over the rails, then she passed the can to him with an offhand, here. I better be going. I'll see you round, Minato. As she trotted away, Minato looked over the rail to see what damage she'd done. Unfortunately, at the same time, a rather wet and angry man looked up and saw Minato. Oi! You, kid! Get down here so I can shove that can right up your... Oh, dear! Minato looked around desperately for help, but Kushina had already vanished. That's it for part 1. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.